On a quiet night in the city of Baghdad, in the year 1926, the lamps burned low along the Tigris. In a house where maps and manuscripts lay scattered upon the desk, a woman placed small white pills upon the table beside her bed. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of dust and old paper, and the distant calls of merchants faded into silence as the city drifted into slumber. There, in the stillness of the desert's edge, the life of Gertrude Bell reached its final chapter, not with noise or proclamation, but with the soft, unseen closing of a door. Welcome, dear listener, to this night's journey. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a gentle note in the comments, telling us where in the world you are listening and at what hour this voice finds you. In this way, we become a quiet community spread across oceans and continents, bound by memory and time. And if you wish to walk with us again through other lives long past, do not forget to press the subscribe button so our paths may cross in future stories. Now, let us walk slowly into the desert wind and into the story of Gertrude Bell. The night of her death has always held a mystery, even for those who knew her best. Was it despair, fatigue, or an unspoken sense that her life's great work had already been completed? The truth cannot be known. Yet the stillness of that moment opens the gate through which her entire life may be traced, a life both celebrated and controversial, marked by brilliance and by solitude. Like the sands of Arabia which she crossed countless times, her memory shifts with every telling. Some saw her as the queen of the desert, a woman who rode fearlessly where few men dared. Others named her an agent of empire, a spy in the shadows of politics. Between admiration and suspicion, between devotion and betrayal, she walked a path that no other woman of her age had trodden. But before the desert and before the empire, there was a child, born in the northern land of England, among iron and smoke. And to understand her end, we must return first to her beginning. Gertrude Margaret Lothian Bell was born on the 14th day of July in the year 1868 in the county of Durham. Her family's fortune came from ironworks, the furnaces blazing red in the night sky, sending their sparks up into the heavens. She was born into privilege, yet also into a web of expectation. For the Bells were not only wealthy, they were part of that class which shaped Victorian England's moral codes. A daughter was to be well educated, but not too ambitious. She was to marry suitably, manage a household, and reflect the dignity of her family's name. Beyond the gardens of their estate lay a world of workers and mines, of harsh winters, and the ceaseless labor of men beneath the earth. But for young Gertrude, the estate was a place of books and long walks, of a mind restless with questions. In the evenings, when lamps glowed against the darkened sky, she sat beside her grandfather, Sir Isaac Lothian Bell, himself a man of influence whose sharp mind and strong will seemed to leave a deep impression upon her. It was said that she absorbed languages as easily as others breathed air. Even in her youth, she was known for her quick tongue and her sharper wit. But more than knowledge, there was a certain hunger in her eyes, a restlessness that could not be stilled. What lay beyond the hedges of Redcar, beyond the hills of Yorkshire, beyond the narrow life prepared for her? Did she know even then that she would leave behind the drawing rooms of England to cross deserts and mountains, to sit in councils of kings? Perhaps not. Yet the first seed was already sown, the refusal to accept boundaries set by others. Her mother died when Gertrude was only 3. This loss so early shadowed her childhood, though her father, Sir Hugh Bell, remained a figure of warmth and guidance. Her stepmother, Florence, added another presence, intelligent and literary, who encouraged the girl's education. Surrounded by wealth and opportunity, Gertrude might have lived a comfortable life. But comfort was never her desire. She chose instead the sharp edge of challenge, the thrill of the unknown. Even in childhood, when the family gathered in the parlor, she would sit absorbed in histories, traveling in imagination across lands she had never seen. Oxford, at the end of the 19th century, was not a place designed for women. They were admitted to study, but their presence was often met with skepticism, and no degrees were formally awarded to them. Yet Gertrude entered with determination, reading modern history. She moved among cloisters and old stone walls, her footsteps echoing in spaces where women's voices were still rare. She worked with intensity, devouring texts, engaging in arguments, challenging her tutors with her breadth of thought. When her final examinations came, she achieved a first class in history, one of the first women to do so. But when the ceremony of degrees was held, she was absent, for no parchment could yet bear the names of women. Imagine her watching from afar, the bells of the university ringing out, while the gates of recognition remained half-closed. Yet even this denial seemed to strengthen her will. If England refused her full acknowledgement, perhaps the wider world would grant it. After Oxford, she turned her eyes outward toward the east. The first journey was to Persia in 1892, where she visited her uncle, then stationed in Tehran. It was here, among gardens filled with roses and fountains, that the young woman's fascination deepened into passion. She learned Persian with astonishing speed and soon conversed in its poetry as if she had known it from childhood. She wrote long letters home, filled with detail, of mountains rising like guardians over valleys, of bazaars alive with colors and scents, of the dignity and hospitality of those she met. Yet Persia gave her more than landscapes and words. It gave her her first taste of love. Henry Cadogan, a British diplomat, became her companion. They rode together, spoke together, dreamed together. For the first time, Gertrude's heart, usually so fiercely independent, softened. But the approval of family was absent. Her relatives disdained the match, questioning his fortune, his suitability. Gertrude stood torn between her longing and the pressure of those around her. Before resolution could come, fate intervened. Henry fell ill and died suddenly in 1893. Gertrude was left bereft, holding in her hands letters that could no longer be answered, walking in gardens where the roses seemed all ready to fade. This wound never fully healed. It was perhaps the moment that set the course of her solitude, the silent knowledge that she might always remain apart. What does grief do to a young spirit? Some withdraw into safety, others plunge headlong into the world. For Gertrude, it was the latter. Mountains became her refuge as she turned to climbing in the Alps. With rope and ice axe, she scaled peaks where the air thinned and the snow blinded. Her companions, male guides hardened by experience, were often left astonished at her endurance. The crunch of snow beneath her boots, the sting of icy winds, the white silence of high summits, these became her companions. Perhaps danger itself dulled the sharper edge of sorrow. Perhaps each peak conquered was a way of saying to the world and to herself that she could not be broken. Yet the mountains, too, were but a passage. Beyond them lay deserts, and in deserts she would find her true calling. But that is for another night's telling. For now, let us leave her standing at the edge of a Persian garden, the scent of roses mingling with dust, the diary closing upon a page that speaks of love and loss. Outside her window the Tigris flowed, silent as ever, carrying with it the stories of empires and strangers. The river that bore her last breath would also carry us backward, to where the child first read by candlelight, and where the restless heart of Gertrude Bell first began to beat against the cage of expectation. The closing of that diary in Persia, the soft press of its cover against fragile pages, seemed to mark an inward pause in Gertrude Bell's restless life. Yet books, once closed, are often opened again in different places, and so too did she carry her mind back across seas, to the stone cloisters of Oxford, where her journey of learning had first gathered its force. The ink she laid upon paper in those days was not merely record, but defiance, as if each line insisted that a woman's voice could linger on the same parchment where for centuries only men had spoken. She had entered those ancient halls in 1886, walking past carved arches and ivy-clad walls, feeling both the weight of tradition and the subtle chill of doubt from those who saw in her only a curiosity, a daughter of wealth dabbling where she did not belong. Yet within the libraries she found her refuge. By the dim light of high windows, the scent of leather bindings and old dust around her, she read with an intensity that startled her tutors. To her, the chronicles of past empires were not dry records. They were living maps of ambition, folly, and endurance, and she longed to walk in the footsteps of those whose names lay fading on the page. History was no abstraction. It was a mirror she held up to her own age, to her own unsettled soul. The university, despite its grandeur, held barriers as stubborn as any mountain peak. Women were permitted to study, but degrees remained denied. It was as though one might climb to the summit only to find the gate still barred. In her final examinations, she excelled beyond expectation, achieving a first class in modern history, but no parchment would ever bear her name. When the bells rang for the ceremony of conferral, she stood apart, hearing their echoes with mixed pride and bitterness. To some, it might have been discouragement, but to Gertrude it was confirmation of what she already suspected, that recognition, if it came at all, must be wrested from the wider world, not bestowed within narrow walls. And so she turned outward, her eyes lifted beyond the stone and rain of England toward the brightness of foreign skies. Upon leaving Oxford, she entered into the social circuits expected of her class. Receptions, family gatherings, the endless dance of introductions and polite talk. Yet even in such settings, her sharpness of mind made her conspicuous. She spoke with speed, with knowledge, with a kind of impatience for trivialities. Some admired her brilliance, others found her unsettling. Suitors were few who could match her intellect, and fewer still who could endure her independence. She was at once admired and isolated, a pattern that would repeat across the decades of her life. For while she moved easily in society, she was never contained by it. Something within pressed her always toward the horizon. Travel became her release, Europe first, then further. She roamed the cities of the continent, observed politics, absorbed languages. She spoke French and German with fluency, Italian with grace, Persian with poetry, Arabic with precision. It was as though tongues were doors she opened at will, each one giving her entry into another soul of the world. In 1892, she returned to Persia, and though love had been lost there, the land itself still beckoned. She wrote a book from her experiences, Persian Pictures, filled with observations that were at once scholarly and lyrical. Even in these early writings, one feels her peculiar mixture, the eye of a precise recorder and the heart of a wanderer. She was neither wholly tourist nor wholly scholar, but something in between, straddling categories as she always would. Yet the shadow of Henry Cadogan's death lingered. The roses of those gardens were never again the same. Perhaps it was in response to that grief that she sought new heights, literally so. In the late 1890s, she turned to mountaineering in the Alps, finding in snow and ice a stern companion for her restless spirit. To ascend with rope and axe, to step carefully across glaciers, to cling to the sharp ridges where one slip could mean death. This was a pursuit that startled her family and bewildered society. A woman climbing peaks above 10,000 feet, enduring storms and frostbite, was seen as nearly scandalous. Yet she relished the challenge. On those summits she wrote her name where few others had stood, sometimes the first, sometimes among only a handful. The whiteness of snow, the crack of ice beneath crampons, the roar of avalanches in the distance, all became part of her inner landscape. And when she descended, flushed with exhaustion and triumph, she carried with her not only tales, but also a quiet proof to herself that limits existed only to be surpassed. But mountains, for all their majesty, were not enough. Their silence was stark, their solitude profound. but they did not hold the voices of living cultures, the stories of tribes, the shifting winds of politics. For that, she turned again to the east, this time with deeper intent. In 1899, she traveled through Greater Syria, moving among villages, deserts, and ruins. She collected inscriptions, sketched maps, and recorded oral histories. Unlike many travelers of her time, she did not merely observe. She sought to belong, to understand, to be trusted. Her ability with languages, her openness, her endurance of hardship, all allowed her to pass where others might falter. Yet always she remained something of an outsider, a stranger welcomed but not wholly claimed. This paradox defined her. Both within and without, both trusted and doubted, both admired and questioned. Perhaps she herself did not seek resolution, for the ambiguity gave her freedom. Her letters from these journeys reveal not only meticulous observation, but also a deepening sense of purpose. She was not content to admire ruins as curiosities. She wanted to preserve them, to understand their place in human history. Nor was she content to ride through tribes as spectacle. She listened to their grievances, their loyalties, their codes of honor. In her, the scholar and the political mind were already entwining, though she may not yet have seen where that path would lead. Evenings in her tent, the desert wind rattling the canvas, she wrote by lantern light, her pen moving swiftly over paper, her thoughts stretching beyond the horizon. How strange it must have seemed to those who encountered her, a woman, unveiled, confident, moving alone with guides through lands where foreign women were seldom seen. To the British establishment, it was both admirable and alarming. To the people she met, it was often bewildering, yet sometimes inspiring. And to Gertrude herself, it was simply necessary, the life she could not deny. One can sense in these years a gradual shift. What began as exploration became knowledge. What began as knowledge became influence. Her reports, her books, her connections grew. And in the world of empire, knowledge was power. The government began to take note. Colleagues began to seek her counsel, and whispers began to circulate of her potential usefulness beyond mere travel. Yet at this stage, she was still free, unbound by official duty, guided more by curiosity than command. It was this freedom that gave her writings their freshness, their vivid detail, their subtle balance of admiration and critique. She could speak of the dignity of Bedouin chiefs and of the follies of European arrogance in the same breath. She saw both, and she wrote both, even when it troubled readers at home. And so, we return to that image of the diary closing and another opening. For her life was not a single story, but many, layered like the sands she crossed, each wind revealing and concealing in turn. In Oxford's cloisters, in Persian gardens, on alpine summits, in desert tents, she gathered her fragments. What would she make of them? What shape would they form? The answer lay not in books, but in the storms of the century that was unfolding. For as the 19th century waned and the 20th dawned, empires strained, wars loomed, and borders would be drawn by hands like hers. For now, we leave her seated by the dim light of a lantern in a desert camp, her pen scratching across paper, her eyes reflecting the fire beyond the tent flap. Outside, the night wind moves softly over sand, carrying with it the scent of smoke and the distant cry of a camel. Tomorrow she will ride further, into lands where her name is not yet known, but where her destiny waits, unhurried, like the horizon itself. The flicker of her lantern in that desert camp, the scratch of her pen on paper and the faint cry of a camel drifting through the night, these images seem suspended in time, yet when the light fades and the diary closes, another chapter of Gertrude Bell's life begins to unfold. For in those years, though she rode freely under wide skies, the shadow of loss still lay across her heart. Persia, for all its brilliance, had given her not only beauty and language, but also love and grief. The memory of Henry Cadogan lingered like the faint perfume of roses pressed between the pages of a forgotten book. Whenever she passed a garden in bloom, she seemed to pause, her gaze turned inward, as though seeing not the present blossoms, but those of Tehran, where once she had walked beside him. His death in 1893 had struck her at a moment of opening, and though she never confessed it in plain words, her life thereafter bore the mark of a wound never fully closed. Many who suffer such a wound turn toward safety, but Gertrude moved instead into greater risk. It was as though only danger could match the sharpness of sorrow, only the extremes of the earth could steady the turbulence within her. And so, she sought out the Alps with their sheer cliffs and frozen summits. Beginning in the late 1890s, she took to climbing with fierce determination. Ropes, axes, heavy boots, tools that marked her as an equal among men hardened by the mountains. Guides at first doubted her, but soon learned she was not a guest to be led, but a companion who endured as they did, sometimes pressing them to match her pace. She conquered the Meije, the Matterhorn, and numerous lesser peaks, leaving her name in registers where few female hands had written before. Photographs from these climbs show her in heavy skirts adapted for the ice, her face set with calm determination, her eyes alight with something like defiance. To see such a woman on the high ridges was, for many of her time, scandalous. But to Gertrude, it was a kind of liberation. Each summit taken was an answer to those who doubted. Each descent alive was a reminder that she could outpace despair. The mountains offered her a silence different from the desert. The desert whispered with wind and shifting sand, but the mountains roared with avalanches and howling storms. She learned to read the snow, to sense the threat of cracks beneath her feet, to tie knots swiftly with frozen fingers. In diaries, she recorded not only the routes and heights, but also the sensations. The taste of snow melting on her lips, the sting of sleet upon cheeks, the strange exhilaration of looking down upon the clouds. In the company of men who themselves pursued glory on these peaks, she carved out her own space, neither subordinate nor merely tolerated, but respected. For the guides who once doubted her now spoke her name with admiration. In 1901, she and her partner Ulrich Führer completed notable climbs, and her reputation as a mountaineer became established. What drove her upward? Perhaps it was ambition. Perhaps it was grief transformed into energy. Perhaps it was the sheer intoxication of standing where so few had stood. Yet there was more. She seemed to delight in testing the boundaries of what women were told they could not do. In a society that wished to keep her in drawing rooms, she scaled glaciers. In an age that whispered of propriety, she stood on ridges where propriety meant nothing and survival meant everything. The scandal of it all was not only in the act itself, but in the calm with which she accomplished it, as though no explanation were required. For her, it was simply life, lived fully. Yet even the highest peaks could not contain her forever. The call of history, of ancient places and living peoples, returned to her ears more strongly than the echo of avalanches. The Alps were exhilarating, but their stories were written in ice and stone, not in the words of men and women. And Gertrude, lover of languages, longed again for conversation with cultures, for the woven tapestry of human tradition. So from the summits she turned once more to the east, to deserts and ruins and tribes. But the discipline she had learned in mountaineering, the patience, the endurance, the acceptance of risk, would serve her well in the harsher landscapes of Arabia and Mesopotamia that awaited her. In these years, her writing matured. She published The Desert and the Sown in 1907, a book of travels in Syria and Palestine, where her voice mingled description with reflection. Her eye for detail captured the sweep of landscapes and the character of the people she encountered. Yet always, beneath her careful prose, one senses the undercurrent of personal solitude. She was admired in salons, celebrated in reviews, yet still alone. Suitors came and went, but she seemed to hold herself apart. Was it by choice or by consequence of that early loss? No one could say. She filled her days with movement, with work, with purpose. but the quiet of nights perhaps told another story. Letters home reveal glimpses of longing, of attachments unfulfilled, of feelings held in silence because they could not be lived openly. Friends described her as warm, witty, brilliant, but also restless, as though searching for something unnamed. And perhaps she herself never found words for it. Her father remained a steady anchor, offering affection and financial support for her travels. But others in her family often wondered at her path. Why risk so much? Why not marry, settle, continue the family line? She offered no apologies. The world was her companion, history her confidant, the desert her solace. And so, while others returned home after brief journeys, she pressed further, learning dialects, recording genealogies of tribes, charting maps of lands little known to Europeans. Her work began to attract attention, not only from scholars, but from officials. The empire watched closely those who could gather knowledge where armies could not yet march, and in Gertrude they saw not only a gifted observer, but a potential instrument. But before her role as political agent fully unfolded, the personal element of her story must not be overlooked, for at heart she was still that woman who had walked in Persian gardens, still that student who had been denied her degree. Each summit climbed, each desert crossed, each book written was both an act of discovery and an act of defiance. She was proving herself not only to the world but to the memory of the young man lost, and to the child who once stared restlessly beyond the hedges of her family estate. Her life was not driven by one force alone, but by many, interwoven and unresolved. So we leave her now not on a mountain summit, nor in a Persian garden, but standing on the threshold of a greater stage. The 20th century has dawned. Empires jostle for influence. New wars stir beneath the surface. And into this shifting world steps Gertrude Bell, armed with languages, maps, friendships, and an indomitable spirit. The mountains have taught her endurance, but the desert will soon teach her politics. And in that crucible, her legend, both admired and distrusted, will be forged. As the lantern light in her tent flickers low, she sets aside her climbing boots, now scuffed and worn, and looks once more toward the horizon. Beyond it lie tribes, ruins, secret councils, and the great storm of war. The night wind rustles the canvas, carrying with it not the cry of a camel this time, but the faint rustle of papers, maps waiting to be drawn, letters waiting to be written, a destiny waiting to be fulfilled. The scuffed leather of her climbing boots lay beside her, worn from ice and rock, yet on the table nearby the rustle of papers spoke of new journeys to come. For boots may carry one to mountain summits, but maps and languages would carry Gertrude Bell into deserts where horizons stretched further than any peak. The dawn of the 20th century found her shifting her gaze from snowfields to sands, from alpine winds to the dry breath of the Syrian steppe. In her mind, the mountain silence had prepared her for the greater silence of the desert, and the endurance learned upon glaciers would soon be tested under the scorching sun. She packed not only clothes and provisions, but also notebooks, dictionaries, and instruments for measuring ruins. To her, travel was not escape but inquiry, and each day upon the saddle of a horse or camel was a lesson written into memory. Greater Syria, with its blend of ancient cities, tribal encampments, and lonely ruins, welcomed her in 1899 and in the years that followed. She moved through Damascus, Aleppo, and beyond, places where history lay thick upon the stones. The narrow alleys of bazaars offered scents of spice and leather, voices bargaining in a chorus of dialects. She listened, she learned, she greeted with courtesy, and soon tongues loosened around her. The remarkable thing was not only her command of Arabic, though that in itself astonished many, but her willingness to sit and listen to stories of lineage, grievances, and pride. Where other travelers rushed, she lingered. Where others imposed, she adapted. It was this quality that opened doors barred to many of her compatriots. She began to map with precision the traces of civilizations long gone. Inscriptions carved into basalt stones she carefully recorded, bringing to light forgotten kings and gods. Her reports to scholarly societies in England were read with admiration. Yet these stones were not merely relics to her. They were voices from the deep past, echoing beneath the lives of those who still dwelled nearby. She would note in her diary how children played among ruins that emperors once built, how shepherds tethered goats beside arches where priests once chanted. In her eye, the ancient and the present wove seamlessly together, and so her writings carry both the detail of archaeology and the breadth of lived encounter. But the desert is never only a place of ruins. It is also a place of power. The tribes of Arabia, with their codes of honor, their rivalries and alliances, became the living heart of her journeys. She sat beneath the black tents of Bedouins, sharing coffee thick with grounds, listening to genealogies recited with precision. Chiefs spoke of loyalty and betrayal, of raids and truces, of oaths sworn beneath the open sky. Gertrude absorbed it all, noting each name, each line of dissent, each grievance that might spark future conflict. To many it seemed strange that a woman from England, her hair uncovered, her manner direct, should be treated with respect. Yet she was. Not always accepted fully, for she remained a foreigner, but often admired for her endurance and her courtesy. They saw that she could ride long hours without complaint, endure heat and thirst, and speak their tongue without condescension. In this, she earned a trust that would later become invaluable in political arenas. Her book, The Desert and the Sown, published in 1907, captured this blend of observation. In its pages, she described landscapes of haunting beauty, valleys where olive trees bent in the wind, hillsides where wildflowers clung to stony soil, deserts where the horizon shimmered endlessly. Yet alongside such poetry lay keen political insight. She wrote of Ottoman officials, of the tensions between central authority and local autonomy, of the fragile balance that held the region together. She saw with clear eyes the fault lines upon which empires pressed, and though she wrote with a traveler's detachment, one senses in her words a subtle warning that these lands were not mere provinces to be managed, but living communities whose strength and fragility could not be ignored. In her correspondence from these years, one finds moments of joy, moments of weariness, and moments of reflection that seem almost prophetic. She confessed at times to loneliness, to the absence of lasting companionship, to the ache of writing letters that no lover awaited. Yet she also spoke of exhilaration, of riding into a valley at dawn when the sky blazed with color, of hearing the chant of muezzins echo from minarets at twilight, of lying under stars so brilliant they seemed to pulse with life. Such moments stitched themselves into her memory, becoming part of the fabric of her identity. She was no longer simply Gertrude Bell of Redcar and Oxford. She was a traveler of deserts, a listener to tribes, a recorder of ruins, and a woman whose life already defied the boundaries set for her. In England, her growing reputation stirred both admiration and unease. To scholars, she was a valuable correspondent, sending back precise records. To society, she was a curiosity, a woman who ventured where few men dared. To officials, she was an observer whose knowledge might serve imperial designs. Invitations to speak and to advise began to come. She accepted some, declined others, always careful to preserve a measure of independence. Yet already the path toward politics was opening. Knowledge, once gathered, could not remain neutral. Maps drawn for scholarship could be used for strategy. Names recorded for curiosity could become keys for alliances. Gertrude herself sensed this, though perhaps at first she did not resist it. She loved the people she met, yet she also carried with her the consciousness of being British, of belonging to an empire that measured the world in terms of influence and control. Was she a bridge between cultures, or a tool of domination? Even she may not have known in those years. Perhaps both. One image lingers from her travels in Mesopotamia around this time. She rode across flat plains where the ruins of Babylon lay half buried in dust. The wind whistled across broken walls. The Euphrates flowed sluggish nearby, and shepherds moved their flocks across ground that had once borne palaces. She wrote of it with reverence and with sorrow, sensing the fragility of all human grandeur. Empires rise, empires fall, and the traces left are often no more than shattered bricks beneath the hooves of sheep. Did she, in those moments, see a mirror of her own empire's destiny? Did she wonder whether the British rule she served would one day lie in ruins as well? Such questions she did not set down plainly, but her tone hints at them, as though she knew the cycles of history could not be denied. At night, as she sat by her campfire, the flames flickering against the darkness, she sometimes wrote of silence itself. The desert silence was not emptiness, but fullness, alive with subtle sounds, the rustle of sand under hooves, the distant call of jackals, the crackle of firewood. She loved this silence, for within it her mind could roam freely. It was a silence both soothing and unsettling, for it reminded her of her solitude as well as her freedom. And always in the background the memory of love lost returned. But now it mingled with the love she felt for the desert itself, a companionship no man could equal. And so, as the papers rustle on her table and her boots gather dust, she turns her face toward a horizon wider than any she has yet known. The journey has only begun. Ahead lie greater trials, deeper entanglements, and a destiny that will carry her into the councils of empires. But for now, she sits by the campfire, the last embers glowing, and listens to the quiet breathing of camels near at hand. Somewhere beyond the dark, a falcon cries, its voice echoing into the endless night. The falcon's cry echoed into the endless night, a sharp note piercing the stillness before fading into silence. Gertrude Bell sat near the embers of her campfire, listening to that cry as though it carried something of her own restlessness. For just as the falcon soars high yet remains solitary, so too did she glide above the world, admired for her daring, yet touched always by solitude. In the stillness, the past returned unbidden. The memory of Henry Cadogan, her lost diplomat in Tehran, rose again like the faint perfume of roses long pressed between the pages of time. Though the years had passed since his sudden death, the grief still lived quietly within her, shaping her choices, guiding her refusals, shadowing her joy. Others may have forgotten his name, but to Gertrude he remained an invisible presence, a companion she carried not in her saddlebag, but in her heart. The world expected her to marry, to bring her wit and wealth into a household, to fulfill the script written for women of her standing. Suitors came and went, but none could pierce the armor she had forged. Perhaps she held herself apart out of loyalty to a memory, or perhaps no man she met could match the fire of her intellect and the breadth of her ambition. Yet the human heart rarely abides entirely in solitude. Even for Gertrude, whose life seemed so often a journey of the mind and the will, there were moments of attachment, entanglements that stirred both hope and sorrow. Among these was her deep bond with Charles Doughty Wiley, a soldier whose path crossed hers during her travels, and who would remain a figure of affection and longing in her life. Their correspondence reveals tenderness and restraint, admiration bound tightly by impossibility. He was married, bound by vows and by circumstance, and so their intimacy could never fully flower. Yet in their letters one senses the pull of hearts that recognized one another. They wrote of politics, of landscapes, of ideas, but beneath it ran the quiet current of feeling. For Gertrude, these letters were both balm and torment. To be cherished yet withheld, to be seen yet kept at a distance. Such was the paradox she lived. In these entanglements we glimpse not scandal in the loud sense, but scandal in the quiet defiance of convention. A woman of her standing was to be demure, passive, awaiting the choices of men, yet she chose whom to love, even when love could not be fulfilled. She walked freely with men in lands where women were veiled. She dined with tribal chiefs as an equal. She corresponded with officers as a confidant. To society, this was unsettling. To her, it was simply necessary. She refused to diminish herself in order to conform, and in that refusal lay both her strength and her sorrow. Sometimes, in her letters to family and friends, she hinted at loneliness. She confessed to weariness, to longing for a companion who could share the breadth of her journeys, who could ride with her into deserts and sit with her beneath starlit skies. Yet she also spoke with pride of her independence, of the freedom to go where she willed, to choose her own path unencumbered. Did she regret her solitude, or did she embrace it as the price of freedom? Perhaps both. For the heart is seldom simple, and Gertrude's was no exception. She was a woman who carried contradiction within her, yearning and resistance, intimacy and distance, freedom and loss. The shadow of Cadogan's death returned at unexpected moments. A song, a rose, the sight of a young couple, any could stir the ache anew. Yet she seldom spoke of him openly. Instead, the grief transmuted into energy, into a restlessness that drove her ever onward. It was as though she sought in deserts and ruins the companionship denied her in love. The ruins of Babylon, the tents of tribes, the councils of sheikhs, these became her companions, her confidants, her partners in conversation. And in return, she gave them the devotion of her attention, the fidelity of her record, the passion of her intellect. Her love, thwarted in one realm, found expression in another. To those who watched her from afar, she seemed almost untouchable. Scholars admired her precision, officials valued her knowledge, tribes respected her endurance, but few knew the heart beneath the surface. Only in her private letters did the curtain lift, revealing the ache of unfulfilled affection, the desire for tenderness that could not be satisfied by maps and manuscripts. And yet even in those letters, one senses her acceptance. She did not wallow in grief, she transmuted it. She chose to live fully, even if alone. Perhaps that was her greatest defiance of all. And yet, her solitude was never absolute. She cultivated deep friendships, both with women and with men, friendships marked by loyalty and respect. Her stepmother, Florence, remained a confidant. Colleagues in archaeology and politics often turned to her not only for knowledge, but for companionship. Her presence was magnetic, her conversation sparkling, her laughter memorable. She could hold a room with her wit, just as she could win a desert chief with her courtesy. But when the room emptied and the tent grew silent, the solitude returned, deep and inescapable. It is tempting to ask whether her solitude strengthened her achievements or whether it was the wound that propelled her into danger. Did she climb mountains and cross deserts to prove to herself that she needed no one? Or did she hope that somewhere, in some far horizon, she would find the companion she longed for? The truth may be both. For Gertrude Bell was not one thing but many, not a single line but a tapestry woven of contrasts. In this she was deeply human, and in this she remains enduringly mysterious. The falcon's cry fades, but its echo lingers, just as the echo of lost love lingered in her heart. And so we see her riding across a plain, her figure upright in the saddle, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her solitude both her burden and her crown. The tribes watch her with curiosity, the officials note her reports, the scholars read her words, yet none can see fully the inner life that guides her. It is hidden, like a spring beneath the desert, nourishing but unseen. And so, from love and loss, from attachment and solitude, she steps further into her role as scholar and traveler. The heart that could not find fulfillment in marriage finds instead fulfillment in work, in discovery, in influence. Ahead lies not only more journeys, but the great storm of politics and war. Ahead lies her entanglement with empire, her role as spy and architect of nations. But those roles will always carry within them the undertone of this earlier loss, this shaping grief. For the queen of the desert was also a woman who once knelt in a Persian garden beside a dying lover, and who never ceased to feel the shadow of that moment. The night deepens, the stars burn cold above her tent, and the falcon has flown beyond hearing. In its place comes only the faint rustle of the desert wind, carrying her forward into a destiny greater than even she might yet imagine. The desert wind whispered against the canvas of her tent, carrying with it the grains of sand that slip silently across the earth, marking time without measure. For Gertrude Bell, that wind was both comfort and reminder, whispering of horizons still unseen and of the emptiness that solitude could never quite fill. Yet when the desert grew too still, when the ache of memory pressed too heavily, she sought once again the sharp, bracing air of the mountains. There, upon the glaciers of the Alps, danger itself became her companion, a stern teacher whose lessons she welcomed with unflinching resolve. She returned often to those high ridges between the years of 1899 and 1904, her figure small against the vast white slopes, yet her determination immense. The mountains asked much of her, and she gave freely. Dawn would find her already roped to guides, the crunch of crampons biting into snow hardened overnight, the world below fading into mist. Hours of ascent tested muscle and mind alike. One misstep, one careless move, could end in silence beneath the snow. But she relished it. The sting of frost on her cheeks, the burning of lungs in thin air, the sharp edge of risk. These were not punishments, but proofs of endurance, a way to match the pain that lingered inside with the peril outside. The climbing community of the Alps, dominated by men hardened by years on the peaks, at first regarded her with skepticism. What place had a woman among them, weighed down not only by skirts, but by society's expectations? Yet Gertrude did not come to play at adventure. She came to conquer. One by one, the peaks yielded to her persistence. The Finsteraarhorn, the Weisshorn, the unclimbed roots of the Lamegi. Guides who once doubted her spoke with admiration. Newspapers carried her name with surprise. And still she pressed upward, seeking the next ridge, the next summit where clouds drifted like waves around jagged stone. Her letters from these climbs speak of exhilaration. She described the view from summits where the horizon curved endlessly, where peaks rose like islands in a sea of white, where the silence was so deep it seemed the very earth held its breath. She wrote of bivouacs carved into snowbanks, of nights spent sleepless beneath thin blankets while stars burned fiercely overhead. Yet beneath the triumph, one senses also an echo of grief, as though each climb was both conquest and catharsis. She could not bring back the man she had lost, but she could stand where no woman had stood. She could write her name in registers that bore only male hands. She could carve her place upon the very bones of the earth. Society in England watched with unease. Some admired her daring, calling her achievements remarkable. Others whispered of impropriety, of a woman abandoning the gentle path prescribed for her sex. But Gertrude did not climb to please or to scandalize. She climbed because the mountains called her, because danger gave her a language equal to her own restless heart. If others found it scandalous, that was their burden, not hers. Yet even the highest peaks, once scaled, give way to repetition. Triumph fades, the heart seeks fresh horizons. By 1904, she felt again the pull of the East, the allure of desert winds and ancient stones. The mountains had tempered her, had taught her patience, calculation, endurance. They had shown her how to weigh risk against reward, how to trust companions yet also to trust herself when all else failed. These lessons she carried back into the desert, where she would face not avalanches but intrigues, not icefalls but politics. In the snows she had learned to master fear. In the sands she would learn to master men. Before she turned fully eastward, however, she poured her climbing experiences into words, publishing essays and accounts that recorded her feats for readers who could scarcely imagine a woman upon those ridges. But even as she wrote, Her mind already drifted beyond, for while the mountains were majestic, they were mute. They bore no voices save the wind, and Gertrude longed for voices, the voices of tribes, of rulers, of languages yet to be mastered. She longed for the vibrant chorus of life that only the East could provide. In the transition from mountain to desert, we glimpse the breadth of her character. She was at once mountaineer and scholar, adventurer and writer, solitary soul and political actor. Few could match such range, and yet to her it was not contradiction, but continuity. For both mountain and desert demanded endurance, both tested the limits of body and mind, both gave her solitude and freedom. Whether on a ridge of ice or a plain of sand, she was equally at home, equally apart, equally alive. The memory of these climbs, however, never left her. Even in Baghdad years later, she would recall the feel of rope in her hands, the sight of a summit ridge against dawn. She had risked her life many times in those years, and perhaps in risking it, she found a way to value it anew. Perhaps, too, the mountains gave her a taste for danger that would make her later life of espionage and intrigue less daunting. For one who had faced avalanches, the games of politicians may have seemed less perilous. And so we leave her now descending from a summit, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright, her boots battered. Around her the snow glitters in the sun, the air is thin and sharp, the world below distant. She has conquered what few thought she could. But even as she descends, the desert is already calling her name. Soon the crunch of snow beneath her boots will be replaced by the soft slide of sand under her camel's hooves. Soon the roar of avalanches will yield to the whisper of desert wind. And soon the solitary triumphs of the Alps will give way to the entangled politics of the Middle East. The embers of the campfire glow low once more. The desert wind stirs, carrying the memory of mountain storms into the silence of the night. Ahead lies not another climb, but another crossing, not another peak, but another horizon. And in that horizon, her destiny waits. Vast as the sands, shifting as the dunes, inexhaustible as the wind itself. The desert wind that carried with it the memory of mountain storms soon grew into her constant companion, whispering across dunes and valleys as Gertrude Bell set her face toward Arabia and Mesopotamia. The Alps had taught her endurance, but it was in the wide silence of the desert that her spirit found its truest home. She rode upon horses and camels for weeks at a time, her figure small against the immensity of the land, her mind sharpened by the rhythm of hooves and the endless line of the horizon. With her went only the essentials: water skins, a handful of possessions, and always her notebooks, where she inscribed the names of tribes, the shape of ruins, the impressions of voices overheard at campfires. She was no longer merely a traveler or an adventurer. She was becoming a chronicler of a world whose heartbeat few outsiders cared to hear. Her mastery of languages deepened in these years. Arabic she absorbed in its dialects, not as an academic exercise, but as a key to trust. She listened to poetry recited by firelight, to oaths sworn under the stars, to songs carried across valleys. She could match her words to theirs, not only in grammar, but in tone, in cadence, in respect. In this lay her greatest gift, the ability to make others feel seen and understood. Bedouin sheikhs, Ottoman officials, and village elders alike found in her a listener who honored their words. And so they opened their tents to her, invited her to sit among them, shared their coffee and their counsel. She never pretended to be one of them, yet she moved among them with a dignity that blurred the boundaries of foreignness. Her journeys carried her across deserts few Europeans had entered. She visited the ruins of Palmyra, where broken columns stood like guardians of forgotten grandeur, their shadows stretching long at sunset. She wandered through Hatra and Assur, where weeds clung to crumbling walls and shepherds grazed flocks, where kings once ruled. She rode with tribes whose allegiances shifted like sand, whose rivalries simmered beneath gestures of hospitality. and always she observed, with eyes both sympathetic and analytical. For she was scholar and strategist alike, though perhaps she did not yet fully know how the empire she served would one day use her knowledge. At times she endured hardship that would have broken others, sandstorms that blinded both rider and beast, nights when water ran scarce, days when heat pressed like a weight upon every limb. Yet she scarcely complained. In her letters she recorded such trials with a kind of detached calm, as though they were part of the expected rhythm of life. She carried herself with resilience, and in doing so earned the respect of those who guided her. Men who might have scorned a foreign woman came to regard her as a companion of the road, one who shared their dust and their thirst. And in return she learned from them the codes of desert life, the sacred duty of hospitality, the pride of lineage, the honor of keeping one's word even when it brought hardship. The desert was more than backdrop to her. It became part of her identity. She wrote of its silence with reverence, noting that in its vastness one could hear the beating of one's own heart as though it were part of the earth itself. She wrote of the stars that filled the night sky, so many and so bright that they seemed to draw the soul upward into eternity. She wrote of dawn, when the chill of night gave way to a flood of gold across the dunes, and all the world seemed newly born. In such moments she found both solace and purpose. Solace, for solitude did not weigh so heavily when shared with the eternal. Purpose, because she sensed that she was witnessing and preserving a world that modern empires might soon dissolve. Her books from this period, The Desert and the Sown and later Amurath to Amurath, reflect not only her eye for detail, but also her moral sensibility. She described tribes with affection and respect, yet she also noted the pressures of Ottoman taxation, the encroachment of European ambitions, the delicate balances that held peace in fragile suspension. Readers in England marveled at her knowledge, but perhaps missed the subtle warnings she wove into her prose, for she was already beginning to see what others ignored, that the desert was not empty, that its people were not primitive, that its future could not be shaped by outsiders without consequence. As her reputation grew, so too did the attentions of the British establishment. Her detailed maps, her genealogies of tribes, her insights into local politics, these were more than scholarly curiosities. They were intelligence. Officials in London and Cairo began to consult her writings, recognizing in them the outlines of power. Gertrude herself, still moving with freedom, may have felt only the satisfaction of being taken seriously. But the seeds were planted for her later role as political agent, as bridge and as pawn between cultures and empires. Yet despite these larger currents, her letters often returned to the personal, to the intimate impressions of her days. She wrote of riding alone at sunset, when the sky burned crimson and the world seemed infinite. She wrote of the sound of coffee poured into small cups, thick and bitter, as she listened to tales of raids and alliances. She wrote of children running barefoot through villages, their laughter echoing among mud walls. She captured not only the grand sweep of history, but the small tenderness of daily life. It is this combination of the monumental and the minute that makes her writings enduring. And still, beneath it all, ran the undercurrent of solitude, admired, trusted, even cherished, yet never fully belonging. She herself seemed to accept this, even to embrace it. Perhaps she knew that her destiny required such apartness, that to move freely between worlds, one must never be fully tied to any. Like the desert itself, she remained shifting, elusive, both inviting and distant. This gave her power, but it also deepened her loneliness. The desert claimed her, but it could not console her entirely. One can imagine her seated by a campfire, the flames throwing shadows upon her face, the voices of her companions drifting into the night. She listens, she records, she smiles, yet within her the ache remains. And yet in that ache lies the very force that drives her onward. For had she found the settled life, the easy companionship of marriage, perhaps she would never have crossed so many deserts, never have listened so deeply, never have shaped the fate of nations. Loss and solitude, unwelcome as they were, became the fire that lit her path. And so, as the night deepens and the stars burn cold above the dunes, we see her again upon her horse at dawn, riding forward. The desert wind carries her name now, whispered among tribes, noted in reports, spoken in drawing rooms far away. She's become more than a traveler. She's become a figure whose knowledge carries weight. Ahead lie greater responsibilities, entanglements with politics, the shadow of war. But for this moment she is still free, riding where she wills, the desert stretching endlessly before her, the falcon's cry faint in memory, replaced by the steady rhythm of hooves across sand. The steady rhythm of hooves across the sand lingered in her memory long after the desert nights had passed. And when Gertrude Bell returned once more to England, that rhythm seemed to echo faintly beneath the polished floors of drawing rooms and lecture halls. She carried the desert with her, the cadence of Arabic in her speech, the scent of dust and coffee in her clothes, the far horizons in her eyes. In London, these traces made her a curiosity, a celebrated figure whose adventures enthralled polite society. Invitations arrived from salons and clubs, eager to hear of the queen of the desert who rode among sheikhs and deciphered the stones of ancient kings. Yet admiration was never without its shadow. For even as she was welcomed, she was also doubted. Her brilliance shone too brightly for some, her independence too starkly. To some, she was an adventurer, to others a meddler, to still others a woman who had crossed lines not meant to be crossed. In those rooms of England where men debated empire with cigars and brandy, her words carried both fascination and unease. She spoke of tribes and loyalties, of ruins and inscriptions, of the delicate balances that held regions together. She described with clarity what she had seen, the strengths and sorrows of people who were often reduced in British minds to abstractions. Some listened with respect, recognizing her as a valuable witness. Others dismissed her as overly sympathetic, a woman whose admiration for Arabs clouded her judgment. In this tension lay the paradox of her position. Too Eastern for some, too Western for others, never wholly claimed by either side. Her writings deepened this paradox. The Desert and the Sown was praised for its vividness, its authority, its unusual combination of scholarship and lyricism. Yet critics questioned whether a woman could write with impartiality, whether her fascination with the people she met rendered her too close, too partial. Gertrude herself paid little heed to such murmurs. She wrote what she saw, and she wrote it with conviction. But in the eyes of her audience, her words often carried more weight than she may have intended. For knowledge of distant lands was never neutral in an age of empire. What she observed became intelligence. What she recorded became strategy. What she described became justification. Perhaps she sensed this even then, though she did not draw back. The empire's gaze was already upon her, and soon she would be drawn into its machinery. In the midst of these public successes, her private letters reveal a different tone. She wrote to her father of fatigue with social life, of evenings spent speaking endlessly of deserts to those who could not truly imagine them. She confessed a longing to return to the open skies, to exchange chandeliers for stars, chatter for silence, salons for tents. England, for all its comfort, felt confining. She missed the sense of purpose that came with journeying, the immediacy of the desert where each day demanded endurance and each night offered solitude. In England, the days blurred, the seasons passed with little to mark them. It was as though she were suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Friends and acquaintances often pressed upon her the question of marriage. With her wealth, her connections, her intelligence, she would have been a prize, yet she remained unmoved. To her family she explained, gently but firmly, that no match had appeared worthy, that no suitor offered both companionship and freedom. Beneath these explanations lay the deeper truth, that her heart still bore the imprint of grief, and that her restless spirit could not be easily tethered. Marriage in England meant confinement, meant relinquishing the freedom she had carved for herself, and so she chose otherwise, accepting the loneliness that came with it. Her solitude, though sometimes painful, was also her power. In public she shone. In private she wrestled with doubt. Was she serving knowledge, or was she feeding an empire's hunger for dominion? Was she preserving the voices of those she admired, or was she translating them into a language that would be used to govern them? These questions did not yet rise fully to the surface, but in her careful prose one can sense their shadow. She wrote with admiration of tribes whose honor bound them, yet she also wrote with precision of their divisions, their rivalries, their vulnerabilities. Such detail, once in the hands of officials, could become the very means by which those people were subdued. Did she see this clearly? Perhaps dimly, perhaps with unease, perhaps with resignation that knowledge could not be controlled once shared. Still, she returned to the desert whenever she could. England was the place of her birth, but the desert was the place of her becoming. Between these journeys, she moved restlessly, speaking at societies, writing for journals, meeting with statesmen. Her reputation grew steadily. She became known not only as an explorer and scholar, but as a woman whose counsel carried weight. This in itself was scandalous to some, that a woman's voice might influence affairs of empire, yet her authority was undeniable. She had gone where few others had. She had spoken with those whom others could not reach. She'd seen with her own eyes what others only guessed. And in an age where knowledge was power, she possessed knowledge in abundance. Even so, admiration was never secure. Behind closed doors, officials muttered about her willfulness, her refusal to soften her opinions, her insistence on being heard. She was, in their eyes, both asset and nuisance, too valuable to dismiss, too unruly to control. In this precarious balance she lived, always navigating between acceptance and suspicion, between honor and doubt. And perhaps she preferred it so, for she had never sought the comfort of conformity. She had always chosen the harder path, the path of risk, the path that set her apart. One imagines her leaving a London salon late at night, her cloak gathered against the damp air, her carriage waiting. Inside the room behind her linger the voices of men debating policies they scarcely understand. Outside, as she rides away, she looks upward. The sky is pale with fog, the stars obscured. She remembers the desert sky, wide and brilliant, the constellations clear. The contrast sharpens her longing, and so, even as she fulfills her duties in England, she already dreams of her next journey eastward, her next encounter with tribes and ruins, her next chance to sit beneath a tent and listen to voices that spoke of honor rather than of empire. And so, between desert and drawing room, between admiration and suspicion, she shaped her place. Neither fully claimed by the East nor fully at home in the West, she walked a path that was uniquely her own. It was a path that would soon lead her deeper into politics, deeper into intrigue, deeper into the machinery of war. But for this moment she remained poised between worlds, the rhythm of hooves echoing faintly within her, even as the murmur of salons surrounded her. A life of paradox, a life of brilliance, a life that could not be contained. The last candle of the salon guttered out, leaving smoke curling in the dark. Beyond it, in her memory, the desert stars still burned. And it was toward those stars, more than toward the chandeliers of England, that her heart inclined. The last candle guttered out in the London salon, its smoke rising in thin spirals that quickly vanished into the darkness. Yet in Gertrude Bell's memory, above the haze of fog and politics, the desert stars still burned, clear, steady, and eternal. It was to those stars that her thoughts returned, and soon enough her body followed. For England, with its chatter and its doubts, could never hold her long. She returned eastward, seeking once more the companionship of the desert tribes, the silence of the sands, the voices that spoke in tones of honor and loyalty rather than calculation and ambition. The rhythm of her life became a pendulum between two worlds, polished drawing rooms and open skies, but her heart leaned ever toward the latter. Among the tribes of Arabia, she found not merely subjects of study, but companions of the road. She learned their genealogies as others learn songs, committing to memory the long recitations of fathers and grandfathers, tracing lines of descent that stretched back into legend. She listened as chiefs spoke of loyalty, of blood debts, of alliances sealed by oath and broken by necessity. Around the fires, she heard poetry that praised courage and lamented betrayal. Each word she absorbed, each nuance she noted, for she knew that in these stories lay the pulse of the desert. Her notebooks filled with names and verses, with careful sketches of tribal divisions, with maps of routes that had never before been drawn by foreign hand. What astonished those who traveled with her was the trust she so often received. In a land where strangers were eyed with suspicion and women veiled their faces, Gertrude was invited into tents, offered coffee, treated with respect. Some of this was due to her endurance. She bore the heat, the thirst, the long rides without complaint. Some was due to her courtesy. She greeted with humility, listened without condescension, honored the customs she encountered. And some was due simply to her presence, which combined confidence with openness, authority with warmth. Chiefs who might dismiss another foreigner found themselves speaking freely to her, telling her of their grievances, their hopes, their visions for their people. They did not forget she was British, yet they seemed to sense that she carried not only the interests of her empire, but also a genuine concern for their world. Still, she remained an outsider. She could ride with them, speak with them, laugh with them, yet she could never truly belong. She knew this, and she accepted it. Her role was always paradoxical, intimate yet distant, trusted yet set apart. Perhaps it was this very paradox that gave her power, for she could move between worlds, translating one to the other, carrying words across boundaries that seemed otherwise impermeable. But the gift of such movement carried its own burden. For in being everywhere, she was nowhere. In being welcomed by many, she was claimed by none. She often wrote of the honor she admired in the tribes. To her, their codes seemed both harsh and noble, a stark contrast to the duplicities she witnessed in politics. A man's word once given bound him. Hospitality once extended could not be withdrawn. Betrayal once committed demanded vengeance. To European eyes, such customs seemed archaic, even barbaric. To Gertrude, they carried dignity. She did not romanticize them entirely. She saw the costs, the blood feuds, the hardships. Yet she recognized in them a clarity, a structure of meaning that the bureaucracies of empire often lacked. It was this recognition that made her both admired and distrusted. Admired by those who saw her sympathy, distrusted by those who feared her loyalties, were divided. In her writings, she captured not only the surface but the soul. She described the way a chief entered his tent with slow deliberation, the way children peeked shyly from behind veils, the way women carried water jars with grace. She noticed the small gestures that revealed character, the subtle expressions that betrayed intention. Her observations were never cold, they carried warmth, even affection, and yet, as always, they were precise. She wrote with the exactness of a scholar and the sensitivity of a poet. This combination gave her words their enduring power. At times, she reflected on her own position within this world. Was she a friend, a guest, a spy? Was she preserving a culture or preparing it for conquest? Such questions flicker at the edges of her letters, never fully answered. Perhaps she herself did not know. Perhaps she chose not to know, preferring to dwell in the immediacy of encounter rather than the shadow of consequence. But history would not let her remain in ambiguity. Soon enough, the empire would draw upon her knowledge, and the intimacy she had cultivated would be used for purposes beyond her choosing. Yet in these years before war, there remained a kind of purity in her encounters. She rode into villages where no European had set foot, sat in gatherings where women were rarely present, listened to verses recited under the stars. She was moved by their hospitality, by the depth of their traditions, by the resilience of their lives. In these moments she felt most alive, most connected, most herself. The loneliness that haunted her in England seemed to dissolve beneath the desert sky. Here, at least, she was needed, welcomed, valued. Here she could believe that her life carried meaning. And yet, as always, the paradox remained. She could listen, but she could not stay. She could record, but she could not belong. The desert tribes might call her friend, but they knew she would return to her own world, and that her pen might serve masters beyond them. This distance was unavoidable, and it gave a bittersweet quality to all she did. She was close enough to love, but not close enough to remain. Like the falcon whose cry she once heard, she soared above, but alone. One evening, seated by a fire in a Bedouin tent, she listened as elders recited stories of ancestors, tales of courage and betrayal, of raids and feasts. The smoke curled upward, the coffee passed from hand to hand, the stars wheeled overhead. She listened with rapt attention, her pen poised but her heart even more so. When at last the stories ended and silence fell, she felt a stillness within her, a sense of having touched something eternal. And yet, when she rose to leave, she felt again the old ache, the knowledge that she was a guest, not a daughter of the tribe, that her place was always on the edge, never at the center. So we see her again riding at dawn, leaving behind the glow of a fire, the voices of friends, the comfort of belonging. Ahead lies the horizon, wide and endless. Behind her, the bonds of trust, fragile yet real. She rides between them, suspended in paradox, carrying within her the voices of the desert and the expectations of the empire. And in this paradox, her destiny gathers force, like a storm building on the horizon, unseen but inevitable. The campfire smoke drifts into the air, lingering for a moment before dissolving into nothing. It is this image that follows her as she rides, a reminder of intimacy shared and of distance unbridgeable, a symbol of the life she chose and the burden it carried. The smoke of the campfire drifted upward and dissolved into the night air, fragile and fleeting. It lingered for a moment, then was gone, leaving only the scent of ashes behind. Years later, in Cairo, Gertrude Bell would find herself once more surrounded by smoke, but of a different kind. The heavy haze of cigarettes curling above desks, the acrid haze of politics and secrecy thickening the air. The campfires of the Bedouin had given her stories of honor. The offices of the Arab Bureau gave her coded reports, maps with shifting borders, whispers of betrayal cloaked in diplomacy. The Great War had broken upon the world, and with it came a call that even she could not refuse. In 1915, she entered Cairo's Arab Bureau, that curious creation of the British Empire, half intelligence office, half debating club, where soldiers, archaeologists, diplomats, and dreamers argued over the fate of the Middle East. She had arrived not as an intruder, but as someone whose knowledge was already indispensable. Her years in the desert, her friendships with tribal leaders, her mastery of languages, these made her a figure whom generals and officials could not ignore. Yet even so, her presence was a scandal of its own. A woman seated at the table of spies and strategists, her voice taken seriously. This was almost unthinkable in the corridors of empire. Some welcomed her insight, others muttered uneasily, unsure whether to admire or resent her. The Arab Bureau was a place of constant smoke and constant talk. Maps were unrolled upon tables, pins marking tribes and towns, lines drawn and erased as arguments flared. Reports arrived daily, filled with rumors, half-truths, and secrets carried across deserts. Over cups of strong coffee and glasses of gin, men debated whether Arabs would rise against the Ottoman Empire, whether promises should be made, whether promises once made should be kept. In this murmur of speculation, Gertrude's voice carried weight. She spoke not as a theorist, but as one who had ridden the sands, who had sat in tents, who had listened to the oaths of sheikhs. Her counsel was practical, grounded, precise, and often it contradicted the assumptions of those who had never left their desks. She told them which tribes might be trusted, which chiefs held influence, which promises would be remembered, and which betrayals would not be forgiven. In Cairo, she met figures who would shape history alongside her. Among them was T.E. Lawrence, later famed as Lawrence of Arabia. Their partnership was both alliance and rivalry. He admired her knowledge, relied upon her counsel, yet bristled at her independence. She respected his daring, recognized his brilliance, yet saw, too, his impulsiveness, his hunger for myth. Between them lay a complicated dance of trust and competition, a recognition that each carried insights the other lacked. The bureau, filled with shifting loyalties and clashing egos, seemed almost to require such tensions. Gertrude navigated it with the same patience she had learned in the desert, though at times her letters reveal her exasperation at the endless talk, the blindness of officials, the duplicities of empire. And duplicity there was in abundance. For even as Britain courted Arab leaders with promises of independence, secret agreements were being drafted with France to divide the spoils of the Ottoman lands. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, signed in 1916, carved the Middle East into spheres of influence, a betrayal of the very hopes that Gertrude and Lawrence were encouraging among their Arab allies. Whether she knew the full extent of these secret dealings at the time is uncertain, but she sensed enough to recognize the peril of false promises. In her reports, she warned of the dangers of dishonor, of the bitterness that would follow if words given in good faith were broken. But her warnings could not halt the machinery of empire. Decisions were made in London and Paris that ignored the voices of the very people whose fate was being sealed. Her own position was paradoxical once more. She was both insider and outsider, trusted for her knowledge, yet distrusted for her gender, admired for her insight, yet doubted for her sympathies. She walked a narrow line between advocacy and complicity, between serving empire and serving the people she loved. Did she believe she could do both? Perhaps. Perhaps she hoped that by lending her voice within the halls of power, she might soften the empire's grip, guide it toward a measure of justice. Perhaps she told herself that silence would serve no one, that to be absent from the table was to surrender entirely. Yet the tension never left her, and in the years to come it would weigh heavily upon her conscience. The war itself pressed harshly upon the lands she knew. Mesopotamia became a battleground, its cities besieged, its people caught between empires. Reports of famine and suffering reached her desk. She read of villages emptied, of children starving, of disease spreading. Her letters grew more somber, more burdened. She did not close her eyes to the suffering. She recorded it. She mourned it. She tried to mitigate it where she could. Yet she was also part of the machinery that caused it, part of the empire that had chosen war upon these lands. This contradiction, unresolvable, seeped into her soul. In Cairo, the nights were filled with heat and murmur. From her window, she could hear the hum of the city, the distant call of the muezzin, the laughter of passers-by. Within the bureau, voices never ceased, smoke never lifted, plans never ended. The contrast between the life she had once known, silence under stars, coffee by firelight, and this constant haze must have weighed upon her. Yet she persevered. Her task was to speak for those who could not be heard in these rooms, to remind the empire that tribes were not pawns, that promises could not be broken without cost. Whether she succeeded is another question. The record of history suggests that her voice, though clear, was often drowned by larger currents. But it remained. insistent, persistent, a thread of conscience within the fabric of intrigue. It was in this period that her name became more than that of a scholar or traveler. She was now a figure of empire, recognized not only in salons but in intelligence reports, in dispatches to London, in the calculations of generals. She had entered the shadows, willingly or not, and the shadows would never entirely release her. From campfires to bureau smoke, her journey had carried her far, yet always with the same paradox: closeness and distance, trust and suspicion, freedom and burden. And so, as the smoke of cigarettes curled in the Cairo air, she sat once more with pen in hand, writing by lamplight. But these were no longer notes of ruins or inscriptions. These were reports of tribes, estimates of loyalties, calculations of war. The pen that once recorded poetry now recorded strategy, and the fire that once warmed her among friends now burned within a bureau where promises were made and broken with equal ease. The last cigarette was stubbed out, leaving the air heavy with smoke. Beyond the bureau's walls, the desert waited, unchanged, eternal. And it was to that desert she would soon return, carrying with her the burden of war and the knowledge that her role had shifted forever. The last cigarette was stubbed out upon the crowded desk, leaving the air heavy with smoke, the lamp casting a weary glow across scattered maps. Within that haze, voices quieted, papers were gathered, and for a moment the bureau was still. It was in this atmosphere of fatigue and intrigue that Gertrude Bell found herself working beside a figure who would become as mythic as she herself, Thomas Edward Lawrence. Later, the world would call him Lawrence of Arabia, but in those days, he was simply Lawrence, sharp-eyed, restless, quick with words that could cut or charm with equal force. Their paths converged in the bureau's smoke-filled rooms and upon the shifting sands of war, where their alliance was as necessary as it was uneasy. Gertrude admired him, though not without reservation. She recognized in him a brilliance that matched her own, a capacity to grasp swiftly the complexities of Arab politics, a gift for winning trust among tribes. She saw also his daring, his willingness to risk much, his hunger for something greater than the routine of offices and orders. Yet she saw, too, the impulses that made him reckless, the hunger for legend that shaped his choices, the romanticism that sometimes blinded him. In her letters, she praised his courage but tempered it with caution, as though she sensed that the myth he was weaving might one day obscure the truth it claimed to serve. For Lawrence, Gertrude was both ally and rival. He respected her knowledge of tribes, her years of travel, her deep understanding of honor and loyalty in the desert. But he chafed at her independence, at her refusal to defer, at the authority she carried in a world where women were not expected to wield it. Between them lay a current of competition, a recognition that each was a voice to be reckoned with, that each sought to shape the future in their own way. Yet their rivalry did not erase their alliance. Together they served the same cause, though their visions of it were not identical. The cause, of course, was tangled in contradictions. Britain sought Arab revolt against the Ottomans, yet in secret drew lines upon maps that divided those very lands with France. Both Gertrude and Lawrence cultivated relationships with Arab leaders, spoke of independence, praised their courage. Both also knew that promises made by empires were seldom kept. Lawrence, in his later writings, would express his torment at this duplicity. Gertrude, in her reports, cautioned of the danger of dishonor, of the bitterness that would follow broken words. Yet both continued their work, caught between loyalty to empire and loyalty to the people they had come to admire. It was a burden neither could escape. In Cairo, their conversation stretched late into the night. They spoke of tribes, of routes, of strategies, of the men whose trust must be won. They argued fiercely, each unwilling to yield easily. Lawrence's quickness clashed with Gertrude's steadiness, his impulsive visions with her measured analyses. Yet amid the clash, there was also respect. They knew that each had seen what the other had not. that each carried insights born of experience, and so they sparred like equals, their rivalry sharpening their work rather than destroying it. Beyond the bureau, the desert itself was their common ground. Each knew the silence of the sands, the weight of the stars, the endurance required to ride for days without relief. Each had sat in tents, listening to the slow cadence of tribal negotiations, watching as coffee was poured and oaths were spoken. They shared the intimacy of those experiences, and perhaps it was this that bound them more deeply than any political aim, for they both loved the desert, not as spectacle but as a living world, and they both bore the ache of watching it entangled in the machinery of war. Gertrude wrote often of Lawrence to her family. She described him as clever, as restless, as difficult to pin down. She admired his ability to connect with Arabs, to inspire them, to ride beside them as one of their own. But she also worried at his impulsiveness, his tendency to act without thought of consequence. She knew that such daring could achieve much, but also that it could bring ruin. Lawrence, for his part, respected her counsel, even when he bristled at it. He recognized that her knowledge of tribes, accumulated over years, was more comprehensive than his own. And though his fame would one day eclipse hers in popular imagination, in those days he knew that she was his equal, perhaps even his superior, in understanding the desert. Their partnership was forged in necessity. The war demanded coordination, demanded knowledge, demanded trust. Together they contributed to strategies that shaped the revolt against the Ottomans. Together they advised leaders, negotiated with chiefs, charted maps, and together they bore the weight of promises that may never have been intended to be kept. The intimacy of this shared burden created a bond, though one laced with tension. For both knew that history would not be gentle, that the outcomes might not honor the hopes they cherished. When the bureau's smoke grew too heavy, when the talk became endless, Gertrude would recall the silence of campfires, the simplicity of tribes whose word bound them more securely than treaties drafted in capitals. In these moments she must have wondered what Lawrence thought, whether he too felt the dissonance between the purity of desert honor and the duplicity of empire. His later confessions suggest that he did. Perhaps in their private talks they touched upon this sorrow. Perhaps they shared the recognition that they were instruments of a cause they could not entirely believe in. Yet they continued, for what else could they do? To step aside was to surrender entirely. To remain was to hope they might bend the machinery, if only a little, toward justice. It is easy now, with hindsight, to cast their relationship in grand terms. Two legends crossing paths, allies and rivals in shaping the Middle East. Yet in the moment, it was simply two restless souls, working side by side in a bureau filled with smoke, trying to make sense of a world unraveling. Their voices rose above the murmur, sharp and insistent, each determined to be heard. And though they did not always agree, together they left a mark that history would not forget. As the war dragged on, both carried their burdens heavily. Lawrence rode into battle, into legend. Gertrude wrote report after report, traveled to Mesopotamia, advised in councils, witnessed suffering. Their paths converged and diverged, but the echo of their alliance remained. Perhaps in quiet moments each thought of the other, recognizing in the other a companion of the desert, a rival of the mind, an equal in a world where equals were rare. The last ash of the cigarette crumbled into the tray, the lamp burned low, and outside the city of Cairo slept beneath the desert sky. Within the bureau, the silence of night settled, but in Gertrude's mind the debates continued, the voice of Lawrence still echoing, the future still uncertain. And as dawn approached, bringing with it another day of smoke and intrigue, she must have felt once more the paradox of her life. Ally and rival, insider and outsider, admired and doubted, free and yet bound. And so, we leave her in that silence, the echoes of debate still lingering, the stars of the desert beyond the city still shining unseen. Ahead lay Mesopotamia itself, the heart of the land that would claim her most deeply, where the war's cost would become undeniable, and where her voice would carry not only knowledge, but sorrow. The silence of Cairo in those early hours, broken only by the distant call of the muezzin and the rustle of palm fronds, could never quite hush the echoes of debate that lingered in Gertrude Bell's mind. But soon the debates gave way to action, and the smoke of the bureau to the smoke of battlefields. For the war had spread deeper into the east, and the heart of Mesopotamia, land of ancient rivers, cradle of civilization, became its stage. It was here, in the very soil that bore the ruins of Babylon and Nineveh, that she was summoned, not as a traveler, but as an officer, an advisor, an agent of empire. Cairo had been words, Baghdad would be wounds. The journey itself was long, by sea and by river, until she arrived in Basra in 1916. There the humid air clung heavily, the waters sluggish, the tents of British forces sprawled along the banks. Already the campaign had turned grim. Earlier that year, the disastrous siege at Kut had ended in surrender. Thousands of British and Indian troops taken captive, their suffering unimaginable. The land was not easily tamed, and the rivers that once bore the barges of kings now bore the boats of war. Into this fraught world Gertrude stepped, carrying not only maps and notebooks, but also the weight of responsibility. For she was no longer merely an observer, she was part of the command. In Mesopotamia, she witnessed suffering as she had never seen before. Villages scarred by shelling, fields left fallow under bombardment, families displaced by battles they could not comprehend. Famine spread through the land. Crops had withered, trade was broken, disease stalked the weak. She saw children with hollow eyes, women carrying the remnants of households upon their backs, old men bent with grief. In her reports, she did not conceal this. She wrote with sorrow of the human cost, of the misery inflicted not only by Ottoman collapse, but by British advance. She knew these lands had endured hardship before, but she also knew that the current suffering was compounded by the arrogance of empires, who treated the land as a prize rather than a home. Her letters from Baghdad carry this ache. She described the stench of disease, the endless procession of wounded, the futility of victories bought at such price. She did her duty, compiling reports on tribes, offering counsel on governance, advising on alliances. Yet beneath her professionalism lay grief, for she loved this land, its rivers, its ruins, its people. To see it torn by war pained her deeply. She wrote once that she felt as though she were watching a friend struck again and again, unable to shield them, unable to halt the blows. And still she served, because to step aside was to surrender what little influence she might have to ease the burden. In those years, she became more than an advisor. She became, in effect, a bridge between conqueror and conquered. She met with sheikhs, listened to grievances, reported them faithfully, urged officials to honor promises. Sometimes her counsel was heeded, sometimes ignored. Often she fought against the blunt force of military thinking, reminding officers that tribes were not numbers on a chart, that loyalty could not be bought only with coin, but required respect. She argued for justice, for fair treatment, for recognition of dignity. At times her persistence won small victories, gestures of relief, moments of trust. At other times, she found herself powerless, her words lost amid the calculations of empire. It was this tension, between her love for the land and her service to its occupiers, that carved ever deeper lines upon her soul. The war pressed on, and with it, her responsibilities grew. She became Oriental Secretary in Baghdad, a post that gave her both access and burden. Her office filled with reports, her desk with petitions, her hours with consultations. She was tireless, yet exhaustion crept upon her. The climate weighed upon her health, the suffering she witnessed weighed upon her heart, the duplicities of empire weighed upon her conscience. Still she continued, believing that her presence mattered, that without her the misunderstandings would be greater, the injustices sharper, the wounds deeper. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps she was wrong. History offers no easy answer. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, she sometimes walked beside the Tigris. The river flowed as it had for millennia, indifferent to the armies upon its banks, carrying with it the silt of mountains and the reflections of stars. She watched its surface darken at twilight, listened to its murmuring against the shore. In its constancy, she found a measure of solace. The river had seen empires rise and fall, had outlasted kings and conquerors, and it would outlast this war too. To walk beside it was to touch something eternal, to remind herself that even in devastation, life endured. Her correspondence reveals the strain of these years. She wrote to her father of fatigue, of frustration, of sorrow. She confessed that she sometimes felt overwhelmed, that the burdens she carried were greater than her strength. Yet she also wrote of determination, of her refusal to abandon the task, of her hope that through persistence, some good might yet come. She was torn between despair and resolve, between mourning and labor. It was this balance that sustained her, the knowledge that even in failure, to try was better than to turn away. In Mesopotamia, she saw clearly the contradictions of empire. Britain spoke of bringing order and civilization, yet its campaigns brought chaos and death. Britain promised alliances, yet drafted borders in secret. Britain claimed to respect traditions, yet imposed its will with little understanding. Gertrude knew these contradictions intimately. She wrestled with them, she argued against them, she tried to mitigate them, but she could not erase them. They were the foundation of the empire she served, and no voice, however clear, could wholly change that. Perhaps she knew this, and yet she persisted because to do otherwise was to abandon the land she loved to harsher hands. One night, after visiting a hospital filled with wounded soldiers and sick civilians alike, she wrote that she felt as though she were walking in a valley of sorrow from which no summit could be reached. The groans of the suffering lingered in her ears, the smell of antiseptic and decay clung to her clothes. She returned to her quarters heavy with grief, yet still she sat to write her reports. Still she recorded carefully the events of the day. Duty, love, sorrow, all bound together in her weary pen. So we see her in these years not as the triumphant queen of the desert, not as the admired adventurer of salons, but as a witness to devastation. She bore the weight of war not only as an officer, but as a human being who cared deeply for the land and its people. The paradox of her life sharpened. She was both instrument of empire and advocate for those empire harmed, both part of the machinery and its critic, both servant and mourner. And this paradox would never leave her. The smoke of Cairo had been stifling, but the smoke of Mesopotamia was far worse, for it was the smoke of burning villages, of bombarded fields, of hospitals crowded with the broken. In its haze, Gertrude walked steadily, carrying her notebooks, offering her counsel, pressing for mercy where she could. The desert stars still shone above her, though dimmed by the fires of war. And it was beneath those stars, amid sorrow and ruin, that her destiny deepened, shaping her not only as traveler and scholar, but as builder of nations. The smoke of burning villages lingered in the air long after the battles had ceased, and when at last the guns fell silent, it did not bring peace, but a heavy stillness. For silence after war is never simple. It carries the cries of the wounded, the bitterness of promises broken, the ashes of homes that cannot be rebuilt. Gertrude Bell walked through this silence in Mesopotamia as the war ended, and she knew that what came next would be no less difficult. Victory, as declared by the empire, was only the beginning of another struggle. The Ottomans had retreated, but the land they left behind was not an empty stage. It was a living country, filled with tribes, cities, faiths, and grievances. to govern it, to hold it, to shape it into something new. That task fell to Britain, and within that task, Gertrude found herself more deeply entangled than ever before. Her office in Baghdad became a place where the weight of history pressed down upon maps. Rolls of parchment, stacks of notebooks, sketches of rivers and mountains crowded her desk. Pens traced lines where no boundaries had existed before. The empire demanded order, demanded administration, demanded borders. And so she, who had once recorded ruins and genealogies with the eye of a scholar, now recorded territories and frontiers with the pen of an administrator. It was a transformation she accepted reluctantly, perhaps, but also with the sense that her presence might soften the harshness of the task. If maps must be drawn, then let them at least be drawn with knowledge, not ignorance. She worked closely with Sir Percy Cox, the High Commissioner, advising him on tribal relations, on the loyalties of leaders, on the delicate balances that might hold a new state together. She reminded him that lines on paper could not erase centuries of custom, that promises given in haste could bind more tightly than treaties, that injustice inflicted in the name of empire would not be forgotten. Her reports were detailed, filled with the names of tribes, the histories of rivalries, the subtle interplay of faith and politics. To officials far removed, such detail may have seemed excessive. To Gertrude, it was essential, for without it, any attempt to govern would collapse into chaos. The creation of Iraq, as it came to be called, was an act both of imagination and imposition. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates had never before existed as a single nation. It was a mosaic of Arabs and Kurds, Sunnis and Shia, nomads and townsmen. To unite it required not only force but vision. Gertrude believed that with care, with leadership, with respect for tradition, it could become a coherent state. She advocated for Faisal, son of Sharif Hussein of Mecca, as its ruler. She believed him capable of bridging divisions, of commanding respect, of embodying legitimacy. She argued passionately for his enthronement, and her voice carried weight in the councils of empire. Without her, perhaps Faisal would not have ascended the throne. With her, he did. Yet even as she worked for this vision, she knew its fragility. She knew that the divisions were deep, that the resentments against foreign rule were fierce, that promises made during the war still hung unanswered. She knew, too, that Britain's motives were not wholly noble, that oil and influence weighed heavily in decisions presented as benevolence, and yet she persisted. Perhaps she hoped that by helping to shape Iraq, she could mitigate the empire's harsher impulses, could give the people a chance to claim some measure of dignity. Perhaps she told herself that if she did not do this work, others less sympathetic would. But within her letters runs a note of sorrow, an awareness that the very act of creation carried with it seeds of future conflict. Her task was not merely political, but personal. She met constantly with tribal leaders, listening to their grievances, explaining the intentions of the new government, seeking to build trust. She reminded British officers that arrogance could undo what force had achieved, that respect was more effective than coercion. She defended the rights of Shia leaders who felt excluded. She argued for Kurdish recognition. She urged moderation upon those who would impose too heavily. In all this, she became known among Iraqis not merely as an official, but as a figure of influence in her own right. Some admired her, some distrusted her, but few ignored her. She was the woman who spoke with authority, the woman who knew their names, the woman whose pen could shape their future. At night, when the day's work was done, she still walked beside the Tigris. The river flowed as it always had, indifferent to lines drawn upon maps. Shepherds still led their flocks along its banks, fishermen still cast their nets, children still played by the water's edge. To them, the empire's decrees mattered little compared to the constancy of the river. And perhaps, as she watched its currents, Gertrude felt both humility and unease. For what were borders beside a river that had seen empires come and go? What were maps beside waters that flowed endlessly, carrying silt and memory alike? In her reports, she wrote of optimism, of hope that Iraq could endure, that Faisal could lead, that unity could be forged. Yet in her private letters, she admitted doubts. She feared the divisions were too great, the resentments too sharp, the empire's grip too heavy. She foresaw unrest, rebellion, perhaps even collapse. But still she worked, because to stop was to abandon the chance, however slim, of building something lasting. Her life had always been a tension between hope and realism, between love of the land and loyalty to empire. In Iraq, that tension reached its peak. To imagine her in these years is to see her seated at her desk, maps spread before her, pen in hand, fatigue in her eyes. Around her are the voices of officers, of ministers, of sheikhs, of emissaries. She listens, she records, she advises, she mediates. Beyond her window, the Tigris flows, the city hums, the desert stretches beyond. She is at once central and marginal, powerful and powerless, admired and distrusted. She shapes a nation, yet she cannot control what it will become. And so we leave her in this moment, her pen scratching across paper, drawing borders that will echo long beyond her lifetime. The scratching of her pen is steady, insistent, a sound that carries both authority and uncertainty. For even she cannot know what these lines will mean, what sorrows or triumphs they will bring, what future they will carve. The maps lie before her. The ink is still wet, the decision still fresh. But history, like the river, will flow on, indifferent to the hopes of those who sought to channel it. The last line is drawn, the pen set aside, the lamp burns low. Outside, the call of a muezzin rises into the night, mingling with the murmuring of the river. And within the quiet of her room, Gertrude Bell leans back, weary, knowing that she has helped to shape a nation, yet uncertain whether it can endure. The lamp burned low upon her desk, its light flickering against the rolled maps, while outside the call of the muezzin rose into the Baghdad night. The voice carried across the rooftops, echoing softly against the flowing river, as though summoning not only the faithful to prayer, but also the city itself into a new chapter of history. For in those years after the war, the lines she had drawn and the counsel she had given began to take shape in flesh and ceremony. The plan she had long supported, placing Faisal upon the throne, was now to be enacted. And so the city prepared for a coronation, not of an ancient dynasty reborn, but of a new kingdom created in the aftermath of conquest and compromise. The summer of 1921 was heavy with heat, the air in Baghdad thick and shimmering. Processions stirred the dust of streets, banners hung across thoroughfares, drums and pipes sounded in celebration. Amid this orchestrated joy stood Gertrude Bell, watching with both pride and unease. She had fought for this moment, argued for Faisal as the man best able to unite the tribes, best able to lend legitimacy to the fragile construct of Iraq. She had written with passion of his qualities, his lineage, his potential to bridge divides. Now he was here, a tall figure with keen eyes, carrying both dignity and weariness, a man who had ridden through deserts in revolt against the Ottomans and who now must wear the crown fashioned by British hands. The ceremony itself was modest compared to the coronations of Europe, yet solemn and significant. Faisal entered the city with measured grace, his bearing both regal and approachable. Tribal leaders came, sheikhs and notables assembled, foreign dignitaries attended. The city, long used to Ottoman governors, now saw a new sovereign take his seat. Gertrude observed closely, her mind alive with detail, who bowed, who hesitated, who whispered dissent. She knew that beneath the pomp lay fragility, for crowns cannot erase suspicion, and thrones cannot instantly unite hearts long divided. Yet she felt pride. She believed Faisal to be sincere, intelligent, committed. She admired his patience, his ability to listen, his vision for a kingdom that might endure beyond the empire's watchful hand. She had spoken with him often, counseled him, advised him, shared with him her understanding of tribes and loyalties. Their relationship was one of mutual respect, though marked always by the imbalance of power. He was to be king, yet she had been instrumental in his arrival. Did he see her as ally, as friend, as guide, or as reminder of Britain's shadow? Perhaps all at once. She herself saw in him both hope and burden, both possibility and compromise. In her letters, she described the day with restrained joy. She spoke of the crowds, of the solemnity, of her sense that something momentous had occurred. Yet she also hinted at unease. For the kingdom was fragile, the loyalties uncertain, the future unpredictable. She knew that Britain still held the reins, that Faisal's authority was circumscribed, that the people's discontent could not be silenced by celebration alone. She saw the lines of tension that ran beneath the surface, and she feared what they might one day erupt into. But for that day, at least, she allowed herself a measure of pride. Her closeness to Faisal became both strength and vulnerability. She admired him, even cherished him, not with the intimacy of romance, but with the devotion of one who longed to see a just leader succeed. She spoke of him with warmth, defended him fiercely against detractors, sought to ease his burdens by offering her knowledge. He, in turn, valued her counsel, consulted her, relied upon her understanding of the land and its people. Yet others looked askance at this closeness. Some British officials muttered that she wielded undue influence, that she had become too attached to an Arab king. Some Iraqis questioned whether she served him or manipulated him, whether her guidance was loyalty or control. In this tension, as always, she walked a narrow line. For Gertrude, the coronation was not merely a political event, but a personal triumph. It vindicated her years of labor, her long journeys, her advocacy amid doubt. She had helped to shape a nation, had seen her vision realized in ceremony. Yet she also felt the weight of responsibility. To help create a kingdom was one thing, to help sustain it was another. She knew that the days ahead would be filled with challenges, rebellions, disputes, demands for independence, resistance to foreign presence. She knew that her role would be to mediate, to soothe, to advise. And she knew, too, that she could not control the currents of history, that the forces she had helped unleash would one day move beyond her grasp. In the days after the coronation, she continued her work with tireless energy. She wrote reports, met with ministers, listened to grievances. She tried to build bridges between British officials and Iraqi leaders, between Sunnis and Shia, between townsmen and tribes. She urged Faisal to tread carefully, to respect traditions, to govern with patience. She sought to temper British arrogance, reminding her colleagues that the people of Iraq were not subjects to be ruled, but partners to be respected. Whether her words always found fertile ground was uncertain, but she persisted nonetheless. And yet, beneath her determination, a subtle weariness began to grow. She was proud, yes, but also tired. The years of war, of famine, of sorrow had left their mark. The burden of shaping a nation, of carrying responsibility, of walking between loyalty to empire and love for the land pressed heavily upon her. She felt at times that she bore more than she could sustain, but still she rose each day. Still she worked, still she wrote. For she believed that without her, the fragile edifice might crumble more quickly. One imagines her on the evening after Faisal's enthronement, walking once more beside the Tigris. The river reflected the fading light. The city hummed with quiet after celebration. She paused, perhaps, to watch the water, to recall the ceremony, to measure pride against doubt. Did she feel satisfaction, or did unease creep already into her heart? Did she believe that she had helped bring forth a new chapter of history, or did she sense that history would take its own course regardless of her labor? Perhaps she felt both, as she so often did, hope and doubt woven together, inseparable. And so the lamp upon her desk burned low, the call of the muezzin faded into night, and Gertrude Bell found herself once again at the heart of paradox. She had helped place a king upon a throne, yet she knew the throne stood upon shifting sand. She was celebrated as queenly herself, yet she carried solitude that no crown could ease. She had built with hope, yet she foresaw fragility. It was in this balance that she lived, in this tension that she labored, in this ambiguity that her destiny unfolded. The coronation drums grew silent, the banners drooped, the dust settled. The city returned to its rhythm, the river flowed steadily, the stars brightened overhead. And in the quiet that followed, she carried within her both pride and foreboding, both joy in the moment and sorrow for what might come. For power, once given, is never simple, and crowns, once placed, weigh heavily upon all who touch them. The banners drooped in the heavy heat, their colors dulled by dust, and the drums of celebration fell silent as Baghdad returned to its ordinary rhythm. The coronation of Faisal was already fading into memory, and with it the fragile unity of that day gave way to murmurs of discontent. For while some saw in the new king a chance for stability, others saw only a symbol of foreign imposition. And in those whispers, in those doubts, the name of Gertrude Bell appeared again and again. To some, she was the woman who had built the throne. To others, the woman who had overreached her place, a foreigner presuming to shape a nation not her own. Admiration and suspicion mingled around her like dust rising after a caravan passes, visible, lingering, difficult to escape. In Britain, newspapers praised her as the Queen of the Desert, the advisor whose knowledge of tribes had made Iraq possible. Admirers wrote of her brilliance, her courage, her unique position as a woman among men. Yet even in praise, there was unease. Some criticized her for meddling too much, for stepping beyond the boundaries considered proper. Letters reached London questioning whether it was fitting for a woman to wield such influence over policy, to sit beside generals and ministers as though she were their equal. The empire that had used her knowledge with eagerness now fretted at the sight of her authority, for her presence challenged the quiet hierarchy of gender as much as it shaped the geography of empire. In Iraq itself, the picture was no less complicated. Many sheikhs respected her, valued her counsel, recognized her commitment to fairness. She had listened when others dismissed, remembered names when others forgot, honored traditions when others imposed. Yet suspicion was never far. To some Iraqis, she was still an agent of Britain, a voice of the occupier, a woman who might speak kindly, but whose pen recorded loyalties for the empire's use. Others resented her closeness to Faisal, whispering that she had undue influence, that she guided him too much, that she was the hidden hand behind the throne. Admired and distrusted in equal measure, she became a figure around whom anxieties collected. Gertrude herself was not blind to this. In her letters, she wrote with candor of the criticisms, sometimes weary, sometimes defensive, often resigned. She knew she was a target because she stood so visibly between two worlds. She did not shrink from it, but neither did she take pride in it. It was simply the cost of the role she had chosen, or perhaps the role history had chosen for her, for she had not sought power for its own sake, but power had found her, and once found, it clung to her, whether she welcomed it or not. Her work in these years demanded constant negotiation. Rebellions simmered, protests flared, factions contended. She met with leaders daily, soothing, persuading, urging compromise. She reminded British officers of the dignity of those they governed, pleaded with them not to act harshly, warned of the dangers of arrogance. She reminded Iraqi leaders of the limits of the moment, encouraged patience, argued that Faisal's rule could be a shield against harsher domination. Between them all she walked, a narrow path lined with suspicion on both sides. She bore it with steadiness, but the weight of it grew heavier with each passing year. The criticism in Britain was often cloaked in the language of propriety. Officials muttered that she was too emotional, too partial, too sympathetic to Arabs. Others said she was too ambitious, too bold, too ready to speak where silence was expected. Some accused her of undermining colleagues, of pressing her views too strongly. Few acknowledged the contradiction, that the very qualities they now criticized were those that had made her indispensable. Without her knowledge, without her persistence, much of what had been achieved might have faltered. Yet gratitude was quickly forgotten, and suspicion remained. In Iraq, the criticisms were sharper. Some saw her as the embodiment of foreign interference, the woman who had drawn lines upon maps and placed a king upon a throne. They did not doubt her intelligence, but they doubted her allegiance. To them, she was loyal first to Britain, no matter how much she claimed to love Iraq. And in truth, she could not wholly deny this, for she was British, raised in empire, bound by duty, supported by its structures. She belonged to both worlds, but not fully to either. And in that paradox lay the root of mistrust. Gertrude did not retreat from the controversies. She continued her work with determination, believing that her presence still mattered. She wrote reports that urged fairness. She advised Faisal with care. She pressed British officials to listen. She accepted the criticisms as part of the burden. Yet the weariness within her grew. In private letters, she confessed to exhaustion, to the loneliness of being at the center yet apart from all. She wondered whether her efforts were truly shaping the future, or whether they were merely holding back a tide that would inevitably sweep over all she had built. The admiration she received was genuine, but it could not dispel the shadows. British visitors marveled at her command of languages, her ease with tribal leaders, her authority in Baghdad. They wrote home of a woman who seemed almost queenly, who carried herself with dignity and grace, who held the ear of a king. But admiration turned easily to suspicion, suspicion easily to criticism. It was as though no woman could hold power without provoking unease, no foreigner could guide without inviting distrust. And Gertrude, being both, bore double the scrutiny. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she walked again beside the Tigris. The banners of the coronation still hung, though tattered now, their colors faded. The river carried reflections of lanterns from the city, its surface rippling with quiet movement. She paused, leaning upon the railing, and thought of the voices that had praised her and the voices that had condemned her. She thought of the trust she had earned and the suspicion she could never escape. She thought of the fragile kingdom she had helped to create and the uncertainty of its survival. In that moment, perhaps she felt both pride and sorrow, both satisfaction and regret. For her life was always both, never one without the other. The river flowed on indifferent as it always did. It carried silt from mountains, it carried whispers of history, it carried the reflections of stars. And as Gertrude watched, the controversies around her seemed for a moment small beside the vastness of the water. Yet when she turned back toward her home, toward her desk, toward her reports, the voices returned, insistent and inescapable. Admired and distrusted, celebrated and criticized, she walked within their storm, her figure steady, her spirit weary, her destiny still unfolding. She walked wearily back from the river, the lanterns of Baghdad casting long, wavering paths across the darkened streets, her shadow stretching and bending with each step. Behind her, the Tigris continued its endless flow, carrying away the faint glimmer of light, leaving her once more in the solitude of her own rooms. There, with papers spread upon the table and silence pressing against the walls, the clamor of admiration and suspicion faded into something more intimate. The questions she carried within herself. For all her labor, all her influence, all her ceaseless movement between tribes and ministers, she remained a woman alone. And in those moments when the world grew quiet, the ache of solitude returned with unrelenting clarity. Her life had known love, but never fulfillment. The memory of Henry Cadogan in Persia still lingered, a ghost that had never entirely released her heart. His sudden death so many years before had left her with a wound that had never fully healed. Later came attachments tender yet impossible. Charles Doughty Wiley, whose letters to her glowed with warmth, yet could never break the bonds of his marriage, friends and companions who cherished her, but could not match her restless spirit. Time and again, intimacy had hovered near, only to dissolve into absence, and so she carried within her a heart both rich in devotion and poor in satisfaction, filled with longing yet bereft of fulfillment. She was not unaware of this paradox. In her letters to those she trusted most, she allowed glimpses of her inner ache to appear. She spoke of loneliness, of longing for a companion who might share her burdens, who might walk beside her into deserts and sit beside her beneath stars. Yet she also wrote of her refusal to surrender her independence, her unwillingness to trade freedom for comfort, her pride in shaping her own destiny. Did she choose solitude out of strength, or did solitude choose her out of circumstance? Perhaps she herself never fully knew. Perhaps it was both. For in her heart she carried two voices, one that yearned for tenderness and one that insisted on freedom. And these voices could never be reconciled. To the world she appeared radiant, commanding, witty, full of energy. Guests at her table marveled at her conversation, her laughter, her brilliance. Tribal leaders admired her courage. British officials respected her knowledge. Friends cherished her warmth. But when the night ended, when the guests departed and the fire died, she sat alone, listening to the hum of the city outside, the occasional call of a night bird, the restless beating of her own thoughts. In that solitude she found both strength and sorrow. Strength, because she was answerable to no one, free to chart her course. Sorrow, because freedom did not quiet the heart's desire for closeness. Sometimes she reflected upon what her life might have been. Had Cadogan lived? Had marriage been possible? Had love been fulfilled? Would she have remained in England, managing a household, raising children, perhaps writing modestly in spare hours? Would she have forsaken the deserts, the ruins, the politics? She could not say. Perhaps the path of adventure and influence would never have opened if loss had not first struck her heart. Perhaps grief propelled her outward, driving her into deserts that became both escape and calling. In this way, sorrow shaped destiny, as it so often does, turning a life from one course to another unforeseen. Yet knowing this did not ease the ache. Knowledge explains, but it does not console. Her closeness to Faisal was a source of both pride and quiet ache. She admired him, respected him, cherished his trust. Yet always the boundary remained. He a king, she his advisor, their relationship one of duty rather than intimacy. To imagine more would have been folly. Still, she invested in him a devotion that had something of the personal in it, a longing for companionship that could never be acknowledged. To work beside him was to feel needed, valued, respected. But it was not to be loved in the way she sometimes dreamed of in the private hours of the night. And so she carried on, pouring into her work the passion that might otherwise have flowed into love. Her reports, her meetings, her projects, these became her companions. She founded the Baghdad Archaeological Museum, collecting the artifacts of ancient civilizations with reverence, determined that Iraq's heritage should remain in Iraq rather than be carried off to foreign collections. She walked among the statues and fragments, arranging them with care, as though in giving order to relics she gave order to her own restless heart. These projects gave her purpose, yet they also deepened her solitude. For devotion to work, however noble, cannot wholly replace the warmth of human closeness. At times she confessed to exhaustion that went beyond the body. It was the exhaustion of spirit, the weariness of living always between worlds, of giving always to others, of carrying burdens alone. She spoke of sleepless nights, of restless thoughts, of the heavy weight of unshared sorrow. Friends wrote, urging her to rest, to return to England, to seek peace. But she could not. She belonged to the land she had helped shape, to the kingdom she had midwifed, to the river that flowed past her door. To leave was unthinkable, for to leave was to abandon her very self. And so she remained, weary yet steadfast, solitary yet committed. One evening she sat at her desk, the lamp glowing faintly, the air heavy with heat. Her pen lay idle upon the paper. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and allowed herself to wonder. Had she chosen this life, or had it chosen her? Was freedom her triumph, or was it her burden? Was solitude the price of greatness, or was greatness merely the consolation of solitude? Such questions rose within her, unanswerable, lingering like the sound of the river against the shore. She opened her eyes, looked again at the blank page, and picked up her pen. For even in questioning, she did not cease to write, did not cease to labor, did not cease to carry forward the work that had become her identity. The city outside murmured on. Donkeys brayed, merchants called, children laughed in narrow streets. Life continued, indifferent to her questions. The Tigris flowed as ever, its surface shimmering in the moonlight, carrying reflections of stars that no sorrow could dim. She watched from her window, listening to the sounds of the night, feeling both the intimacy of nearness and the distance of solitude. And in that moment she accepted again the paradox of her life, that she was both free and bound, both fulfilled and empty, both admired and alone. The night deepened, the lamp flickered, the pen scratched once more across the page, and somewhere beyond the city, in the vast silence of the desert, the wind stirred softly as though echoing her unspoken thoughts. The desert wind stirred softly in the distance, as though echoing her unspoken thoughts, and when its whisper faded into the stillness of Baghdad, Gertrude Bell turned her energy once more to work that might endure beyond her own weary life. If love had eluded her, and if politics had wearied her, there yet remained the treasures of the past, mute witnesses of civilizations that had risen and fallen along the rivers she had come to love, and so she turned her devotion to the founding of the Baghdad Museum, a place where the relics of Mesopotamia might be gathered not for plunder, but for preservation, where the stones of ancient kings might rest upon their native soil rather than be shipped abroad into foreign halls. It was in these later years that she walked often among excavations, stooping to brush dust from carved reliefs, lifting with reverent hands fragments of pottery, studying inscriptions weathered by centuries. She spoke passionately of the need to keep such treasures in Iraq, to give the new nation a sense of its own ancient inheritance. She wrote to colleagues in London, urging them to resist the temptation of export, reminding them that these artifacts were not curiosities, but the soul of a people. Some resisted, some scoffed, some yielded, but her persistence bore fruit. The Baghdad Museum was established, and into its halls were gathered statues, tablets, vases, and fragments from the soil of Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria. She arranged the pieces with care, walking slowly through the dusty halls, considering where each artifact might stand, how best to speak silently to the visitor. To her, the museum was more than a collection. It was a temple of memory, a place where past and present could meet. For the Iraq she had helped to create was fragile, uncertain, buffeted by politics and rebellion. But the Iraq that lay beneath, the Iraq of Hammurabi, of Nebuchadnezzar, of Ashurbanipal, was unshakable. By placing its relics before the eyes of the living, she hoped to remind them of endurance, of continuity, of belonging. In this work she found a kind of peace. The quarrels of ministers, the criticisms of officials, the suspicions of colleagues, all seemed less pressing when she stood before a statue carved 3,000 years before. The gaze of ancient kings steadied her. The curves of old script comforted her. The weight of stone grounded her. She felt that she was no longer merely a wanderer, no longer merely a servant of empire, but a guardian of something timeless. And this role suited her weary spirit. For while politics was fleeting, heritage endured. Yet even here, controversy followed her. Some accused her of privileging archaeology over the needs of the living, of caring more for stones than for starving families. Others accused her of nationalism in disguise, of seeking to bind Iraq to its ancient past in order to strengthen British influence in its present. Still others doubted the very idea of a museum in a land struggling with poverty and unrest. Gertrude listened, defended, argued, persisted. She believed deeply that without memory, no nation could endure. A people cut off from its past was rootless, vulnerable, easily swayed. By giving Iraq its museum, she hoped to anchor it in something older than empire, older than kings, older even than faiths. Her letters from these years reveal both pride and weariness. She spoke with satisfaction of treasures saved, of halls arranged, of visitors marveling at their own inheritance. Yet she also spoke of exhaustion, of illness, of the toll the climate and stress took upon her body. She wrote of financial worries, of the loneliness that pressed upon her more heavily with each passing year, of the sense that her work was valued less in Britain even as it was cherished in Iraq. She was by turns buoyed by achievement and crushed by fatigue. But still she labored, still she gave, still she poured what remained of her strength into the project. Sometimes she walked alone through the museum's empty halls at twilight, her footsteps echoing against stone, her figure dwarfed by statues of winged bulls and kings. In those silent moments she felt herself a companion to the ancient dead, a guardian keeping watch over memory itself. Did she feel then that she had at last left something that would endure, that her life had not been spent only in passing causes, but in something lasting? Perhaps. The museum was not merely a collection, but a legacy, a tangible mark of her devotion to the land. And though she could not know it, her work would indeed outlast her, surviving wars, upheavals, even the looting of later years. Yet peace, even in this, was fleeting, for her health declined, her body weakened, her spirit strained. She grew thin, fatigued, plagued by illness. Friends urged her to return to England to rest, to recover. But she refused. To leave Baghdad was unthinkable. It was here she belonged. Here she had given her labor. Here she wished to remain. She had tied her fate irrevocably to the fate of Iraq, and she would not sever that bond, however much it cost her. One can picture her in those days, walking slowly through the museum's halls, her steps measured, her face pale yet resolute. Around her loomed the statues of kings long gone, their eyes carved in stern calm, their silence eternal. She paused before them, perhaps speaking softly, as though conversing across centuries, and then she moved on, arranging, directing, preserving. Her body faltered, but her will did not. And so, as the desert wind stirred softly beyond the city, she sought to leave behind something that would endure beyond her own breath, for she knew her time was waning, that her strength was failing, that the burden she carried could not be borne much longer. She hoped, perhaps, that when she herself was gone, the museum would speak for her, that the stones she had gathered would whisper to future generations of the woman who had loved them, who had fought for them, who had sought to keep them safe upon their native soil. The twilight deepened, the lamps in the museum flickered, and outside the night fell upon Baghdad. She closed the doors behind her, carrying the keys in her hand, her figure solitary against the fading light. And in that solitude, as ever, lay both her sorrow and her triumph. For she had given herself fully, and though her body was failing, her work stood. The museum doors closed behind her with a heavy sound, the keys cool in her hand, the twilight pressing softly against her figure as she stepped back into the city's weary heat. Within those halls, the relics of kings rested in silence. Outside, the noise of Baghdad returned. Merchants bargaining, donkeys braying, soldiers clattering past. She walked home slowly, her body thinner now, her step less firm, her spirit still willing, but her strength fading. For in these final years the burdens she had carried so long pressed more heavily upon her, and even she, whose endurance had astonished so many, could not hold them forever. Her health faltered in ways she could not ignore. Fevers returned. Her breath grew short. Her energy drained more swiftly each day. Doctors spoke of fatigue, of strain, of a body worn by years of desert travel, by endless labor, by sorrow. She listened politely, but without much hope, for she knew the truth. It was not merely her body that was failing, but the weight of disappointment and loneliness that had become too much to bear. Nights of sleeplessness stretched long, her thoughts restless, her spirit turning upon itself. She still rose each morning, still worked, still met with officials and sheikhs, but beneath the surface lay exhaustion, heavy and unrelieved. Politics, once the arena where her voice carried strength, now wearied her beyond measure. The quarrels of ministers, the suspicions of colleagues, the duplicities of empire, all seemed endless, a circle without resolution. She argued still for fairness, pleaded still for respect toward the people of Iraq, counseled still for patience and dignity. But her words met resistance more often than they once had. Younger officials dismissed her as outdated. Superiors grew impatient with her persistence. Colleagues muttered that she interfered too much. In England, her name was praised less frequently. In Baghdad, her authority waned. She felt herself drifting from the center to the margins, even as she continued to give all that she could. The kingdom she had helped to build remained fragile, beset by discontent and rebellion. Faisal, whom she had cherished and defended, struggled to balance the demands of Britain with the expectations of his people. She watched him with sympathy, knowing the difficulty of his path, yet she could not shield him from every blow. At times she wondered whether she had done right in pressing for his rule, whether she had woven a crown from reeds that could not hold. These doubts gnawed at her, adding to her weariness. For if her great achievement was flawed, then what of her life's purpose? Amid these burdens she retreated often to the solace of the museum, or to her home where books and papers crowded the shelves. She wrote letters still, though more often now they spoke of fatigue. To her father she confided her sense of decline, her inability to recover strength. To friends she hinted at sorrow deeper than illness, the sorrow of a life lived always in paradox, a life admired yet lonely, purposeful yet haunted by futility. She admitted at times that she no longer wished to endure the weariness, that she longed for rest, though she rarely spoke the words directly. They lingered between the lines, half hidden, like shadows upon the page. Financial worries pressed as well. Her income dwindled, her expenses in Baghdad weighed upon her. Her independence, once a source of pride, now became a source of strain. She who had once seemed above such concerns now found herself anxious about bills, about debts, about the future. Pride kept her from confessing fully, yet the anxiety gnawed at her spirit. It was another thread in the web of weariness that wrapped around her. She remained in Baghdad despite all. Friends urged her to return to England, to recover in the coolness of her homeland, to seek comfort among family, but she refused. She belonged to Iraq, to the rivers, to the desert, to the museum she had built. To leave was unthinkable, for it would mean abandoning not only her work but her very self. And so she stayed, even as her strength ebbed, even as her sorrow deepened. In her solitude she turned often to reflection. She asked herself what her life had been, what it had meant, what it had achieved. She thought of mountains climbed, deserts crossed, tribes befriended, kings advised. She thought of the museum standing as her legacy, of books filled with her words, of borders drawn with her hand. Yet she also thought of loves lost, of solitude endured, of promises broken by empire, of mistrust that shadowed her name. Was it enough? Had she given her life to something lasting, or had she merely built upon sand? Such questions weighed heavily, and no answer brought peace. One evening, as the city hushed beneath the heavy air, she walked once more by the river. The Tigris flowed steadily, indifferent to empire, indifferent to sorrow, carrying with it the silt of ages. She leaned upon the railing, her breath short, her body weary. She listened to the water's murmur, remembering all she had seen, all she had done, all she had lost. In its flow she heard both consolation and judgment. Consolation that life endures beyond any one person. Judgment that her own labors, however great, were but a ripple in its current. The stars brightened above, the lamps flickered along the banks, the city's hum softened into silence. She returned to her home, the keys of the museum still in her hand, her figure solitary against the night. Within her lay the knowledge that both empire and self were nearing their limits, that both had expended their strength, that both stood at the edge of decline. And though she still rose each day, still gave what she could, she knew the time was drawing near when she could give no more. The lamp on her desk flickered once again, papers scattered, letters half-written. She laid her pen aside, folded her hands, and sat quietly in the deepening night. Outside, the desert wind stirred faintly, carrying with it the ancient scent of dust and memory, as though whispering to her that her journey was nearly complete. The desert wind stirred faintly outside her window, carrying with it the taste of dust and the memory of wide horizons. But within Gertrude Bell's home, the air was heavy with stillness. Her body had grown frail, her face drawn, her movements slowed. Each day she rose with effort, tending still to her duties, writing still to her family, walking when she could to the museum she loved. Yet those who saw her noted the weariness that clung to her, the way her step faltered, the way her eyes seemed at times to gaze inward rather than outward, as though measuring the distance not of maps but of her own remaining days. Letters from these final months reveal her exhaustion with stark honesty. She wrote of sleepless nights, of a mind that would not rest, of a body that no longer obeyed her spirit's demands. To her stepmother she confessed that she often wished the struggle might end, that she longed for quiet release. To friends she hinted at despair, cloaked in courtesy but undeniable between the lines. She wrote still of work, of politics, of the museum, but her tone carried the shadow of resignation. It was as though she had given all she could and had nothing left to offer except her presence. In Baghdad, summer pressed down mercilessly, the air thick and scorching, the river low and sluggish. The city pulsed with its own rhythms, indifferent to her decline. Officials came and went. Faisal struggled still with his throne. Tribes murmured with discontent, and the empire's shadow stretched over all. Yet for Gertrude, these matters seemed increasingly distant. She attended to them, yes, but with less fire, less conviction, as though she had already stepped half into silence. Her true devotion now lay with the museum, where she lingered among relics as if in the company of companions who asked nothing of her but her reverence. Her health worsened in July of 1926. Friends grew concerned. Doctors prescribed rest, yet nothing eased her weariness. She was plagued by insomnia, tormented by anxiety, crushed by financial worries that embarrassed her deeply. She confided to her father that she feared being a burden, that her resources were dwindling, that her independence was slipping away. For a woman who had always prized her self-sufficiency, this humiliation was nearly unbearable. To illness and loneliness was added the fear of dependence, and together they formed a weight too heavy for her spirit to bear. On the evening of July 11th, she dined quietly with friends, speaking gently, smiling faintly, giving little sign of the turmoil within. She returned home late, the city dark and hushed. In the early hours of July the 12th, she took a dose of sleeping pills, some say by mistake, misjudging the strength in her desperation for rest. Others believe by intention, choosing at last to end the struggle she had endured so long. She lay down in her bed, the night pressing softly around her, and did not rise again. Her maid found her in the morning, still and cold, the vial upon the table, the room quiet save for the faint rustle of the river beyond. The news spread quickly, first among friends, then through Baghdad, then across the empire. Gertrude Bell, the queen of the desert, the maker of Iraq, the scholar, the mountaineer, the spy, the mourner, was gone at the age of 57. Her death was mourned in Baghdad with genuine sorrow. Faisal himself attended her funeral, walking behind the coffin as it passed through the streets. Iraqi officials, British officers, tribesmen, scholars, friends, all gathered to pay their respects. She was buried in the British cemetery in Baghdad, beneath the same desert sky that had been her companion so many years. The crowd was large, the grief palpable. For though she had been controversial, though she had been admired and mistrusted in equal measure, few could deny the depth of her devotion to the land and its people. In England, news of her death was met with shock and sadness. Newspapers published obituaries recounting her adventures, her achievements, her brilliance. Some praised her as a heroine of empire, others noted the controversy of her influence, but most acknowledged her as a woman who had lived extraordinarily, who had broken barriers, who had shaped history. Friends lamented her solitude, regretted the burdens she had borne, mourned the loss of a spirit so rare. Her grave in Baghdad became a quiet place of pilgrimage. Visitors came to stand before the stone, to lay flowers, to remember the woman who had walked between worlds. The inscription upon her tomb was simple, yet those who knew her carried with them memories far more complex, of her laughter and wit, her sharp counsel, her compassion, her contradictions. She had lived fiercely, and she had died quietly, leaving behind a legacy as enduring as it was ambivalent. In the silence after her passing, questions remained. Did she intend her death, or was it a mistake born of sleeplessness? Was she overcome by despair, or simply weary beyond endurance? Did she believe her work had been enough, or did she die doubting its worth? No one could answer fully. Her life had been filled with paradox, and so too was her death, at once sudden and long foreshadowed, at once tragic and inevitable. What is certain is that she left behind both grief and memory. Grief for those who loved her, who admired her, who depended on her counsel. Memory for the land she had served, for the museum she had built, for the borders she had drawn, for the words she had written. Her presence lingered in the stones of ancient ruins, in the shelves of the museum, in the flowing of the river, in the very air of the desert. She was gone, but she was not forgotten. And so the desert wind continued to stir softly, carrying with it not only dust but also the faint echo of her voice, the memory of her laughter, the whisper of her sorrow. Baghdad returned to its rhythms. The empire moved on. The world forgot in part, but the desert remembered. For the desert keeps its secrets, and among them it keeps the story of Gertrude Bell, the woman who loved it fiercely, who walked upon its sands with courage and solitude, who gave to it her life and found in it both solace and sorrow. The desert wind kept her memory, carrying her name across the dunes long after the world beyond Baghdad had shifted its gaze. In the silence of the ruins she had loved, in the stones she had preserved, in the borders she had helped to shape, traces of Gertrude Bell remained, faint yet indelible. The empire moved on, kings rose and fell, wars broke and returned, but the desert remembered. It remembers still, for it has always been the keeper of stories, holding them in its silence until they are spoken again. And so we return, at the close of her life, to ask what legacy she left, what meaning can be drawn from her journey, what measure might be taken of a woman who was at once celebrated and doubted, admired and mistrusted, fulfilled and alone. Her legacy is written first in stone, in the Baghdad museum she founded, in the tablets and statues she saved from exile, in the ancient voices she preserved for future generations. Though wars would later ransack its halls, though looters would scatter its treasures, The vision she left endured, that Iraq's past belonged to its people, that its roots reached deep into time, that no empire could erase its memory. In this, she gave a gift that outlasted her, one that future generations, even amid upheaval, could still claim. Her legacy is written, too, in maps, in the lines she drew upon paper, in the boundaries she advised. The modern state of Iraq, fragile and contested, bore her mark. Some would call it creation, others imposition, but none could deny her hand in its birth. Was this a gift or a burden, a triumph or a tragedy? The answer shifts with time, with perspective, with the voices of those who live within those borders. Perhaps she knew it would be so. Perhaps she foresaw that her work would be questioned as much as it was praised. Yet she did it nonetheless, believing in the possibility of unity, in the chance that hope might prevail over division. Her legacy is written also in memory, in the letters she left behind, in the books she published, in the stories others told of her. She became a figure of fascination, the queen of the desert, the woman who climbed mountains, crossed deserts, advised kings. Some painted her as heroine, some as meddler, some as anomaly. Each portrait captures part of her, none captures all, for she herself was too complex, too paradoxical to be contained in any single image. She was scholar and spy, adventurer and mourner, builder and critic, believer in empire and its reluctant conscience. To speak of her is always to speak in contradictions, and her legacy is written finally in silence, in the solitude she carried, in the unfulfilled loves, in the nights of sleeplessness, in the quiet of her final hours. For beyond the public figure, beyond the headlines and reports, there was always a woman who longed for closeness, who suffered loss, who bore weariness. In her solitude lies a truth that no achievement can erase, that even the most brilliant, the most daring, the most celebrated remain human, fragile, haunted by questions that no legacy can answer. So how is such a life to be measured? By borders drawn or by letters written? By artifacts preserved or by friendships formed? By the kingdom she helped create or by the loneliness she endured? Perhaps by all, perhaps by none. For a life is not a sum of deeds, nor a ledger of triumphs and failures. It is a journey through paradox, a movement between hope and sorrow, a weaving of moments that cannot be neatly judged. Gertrude Bell's life resists judgment, just as it resists forgetting. One might measure her by the desert itself, which she loved so deeply. The desert is vast, silent, filled with both beauty and hardship. It grants freedom yet demands endurance, offers solace yet withholds comfort. So too was her life, vast in achievement, silent in sorrow, filled with beauty and hardship, granting her freedom at the cost of closeness. To live as she did was to live as the desert itself lives, eternal in memory, elusive in meaning, inexhaustible in mystery. Her grave lies in Baghdad still, beneath the same sky she so often watched, near the river she walked beside, among the people she cherished. Visitors may find it quiet, unadorned, a simple stone in foreign soil. Yet for those who pause, the silence around it speaks more than any inscription. It speaks of courage and weariness, of love and loss, of empire and betrayal, of a woman who gave her life to a land not her own and found in it both her purpose and her undoing. And so, as the desert wind continues to stir, we end as we began, with her, standing at the threshold of mystery. Was she heroine or agent, builder or destroyer, queen or pawn? The answers slip through our fingers like sand. What remains is the story, the memory, the voice, carried still across the dunes. Perhaps the truest measure of her life is not in answers, but in questions. What does it mean to belong to no place yet be claimed by many? What does it mean to shape a kingdom and yet be unable to find a home? What does it mean to carry freedom and solitude as inseparable companions? Such questions linger, refusing resolution, echoing softly as the desert wind passes over her grave. The night deepens, the stars return in their countless multitude, the Tigris flows with steady murmur, the ruins rest in silence. And somewhere in that silence, the memory of Gertrude Bell abides, not as certainty but as mystery, not as conclusion but as presence, not as triumph or tragedy, but as the timeless weaving of both. The story ends, but the desert does not. The desert holds her still, in its winds, in its silence, in its memory. And perhaps that is all we can say, that she lived, that she gave, that she longed, that she remains.